Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is a debate on motion number 5444 in the name of Michael Matheson on Scotland's mental health strategy. Could I ask members who wish to speak in this debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Michael Matheson to speak to and move the motion. Minister, 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I move the motion in my name? We published Scotland's mental health strategy in August last year, and I would like to use this opportunity to set out some of the priorities and commitments in the strategy. I also want to hear from members about their views on the strategy and the feedback they've received about the strategy from other stakeholders. Mental illness is one of the top public health challenges in Europe. The challenge we face to improve mental health and mental health services in Scotland is great. However, it is not that different to anywhere else in the Western world, with Scotland across a range of mental health indicators broadly in the middle. The picture is similar with the rates of suicide, with mental disorder strongly related to suicide. The average annual suicide rate in Europe is 13.9 per 100,000. In Scotland in 2010, the rate is 14.5. That puts us a little above the European average, but our suicide rate has continued to fall. I also want to think it's worth noting that the prevalence of mental illness does not seem to have changed significantly over time. In Scotland, we have made some good progress in closing the treatment gap, ensuring that people with mental health problems are more likely to seek help, get a diagnosis and receive evidence-based treatment. In particular, we have had real success with depression and alcohol misuse. However, the bigger challenge is in the detail under the headline figures. Mental ill health affects our communities unequally. People from our most deprived communities are much more likely to experience mental illness. Again, Scotland isn't unusual in this, as the picture is very similar in other countries within Europe. Scotland has a lot to be proud of in how seriously we as a country take mental health. It's telling that this Parliament has debated mental health issues on a number of occasions, debates which have been initiated by government, by committees and by members' business. It demonstrates the real progress that has been made in tackling stigma and being able to talk about and to debate mental health issues in an open and frank way. Although the challenge is a big one, we have made some significant changes in recent years. I'd like to take an opportunity to mention a few of these. Each of these were areas where the Scottish Government set it as a priority and where we have supported delivery in the change. However, one of the key messages I want to emphasise is that the change and improvement was delivered locally by NHS boards, local authorities and the third sector, working with service users and carers. And this is a theme that I want to carry into how we take forward the new mental health strategy, building consensus on what to prioritise and to work in partnership with those who wish to support change. I'll give way to the member.
John Pentland.
Minister, given that this builds on existing Scottish Government policy, why has the Lanarkshire Mental Health Services Plan, which was in line with this policy and approved by the then Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, in August last year, still not been taken forward? And is the Minister aware that since 26 September, when he took over the responsibility for this plan, Alex Neil has continued to be involved as Cabinet Secretary and wrote to Pamela Nash MP on this matter on the 5th of November?
Minister.
The issue about, as I've mentioned actually in the earlier part of my speech, the changes and improvements are delivered locally, and it's for the NHS board to take forward any changes that they see as appropriate and any matters that have to be referred to ministers to do so. And as the Cabinet Secretary has made clear, that if there are any changes that require ministerial input, that's a matter which I will consider at the time when NHS Lanarkshire bring it forward. We've also seen a steady reduction in the number of people being discharged from hospitals then readmitted, a 25% reduction between 2004 and 2009. Being admitted to hospital has social and economic implications, so reducing readmissions is important. The reductions have been delivered through work to improve the quality of inpatient and community services, and also by improving discharge planning. This is something we intend to build on as part of the new strategy, looking to develop better indicators of the quality of community services. Another area where progress has been made is in the prevention of suicides, with a reduction in the suicide rate of 17% between 2000 and 2002 and 2009-11, based on the 3-year rolling average. I will also touch upon this area further, around how we intend to take further work forward in reducing suicide and self-harm in Scotland later on in my contribution. I want to see us to continue to work to deliver our existing commitments to offer faster access to specialist mental health services for children and young people, and also to psychological therapies. I want to capitalise on what we have achieved and to deliver a set of commitments that are designed to increase the pace of change across the whole of the system. In order to achieve this, we need to focus on a number of areas, such as reducing variation in availability of good quality mental health services, such as intensive home treatment and first episode psychosis services. We will build on the prevention agenda with a greater focus on the first years of life. And we'll work with other policy areas such as employment, justice and the early years, where mental health has an important contribution to make. Presiding Officer, there are also 2 areas where we are developing, which we are developing out with the mental health strategy. The first is dementia. We are in the middle of an engagement process to develop a successor to Scotland's first dementia strategy, which will be published in June this year. We've also made a commitment to engage in a new suicide and self-harm strategy, which will follow on from the existing work on suicide reduction and the Choose Life work that's been taken forward to date. And this engagement will start in the next few weeks. Presiding Officer, we also had a great response to our consultation on the mental health strategy, with over 340 responses to the written consultation, along with people who attended our national event and numerous local events. 7 themes emerged from the consultation, which we have used to describe the way in which we want to deliver the commitments in the strategy. These themes support the quality ambitions that health care should be person-centred, safe and effective. And I want to mention a few of these here this afternoon. Families and carers have an important role in providing support to people with mental illness. Often, though, they can feel excluded from making the contribution that they would like. Learning from suicides tell us that better work with families can lead to safer care and better outcomes. We are therefore working with Vox and others to identify how we can increase the involvement of families and carers in mental health service delivery. Another key theme which has come through in the consultation is the issue of tackling discrimination. Scotland, through the work of CME, is internationally recognised for tackling stigma of mental illness. We'll be working with SAMH and other partners to continue to develop our anti-stigma agenda, including work to reduce discrimination and exclusion that many people with mental illness experience. I'll give way to Mary Scanlon.
Mary Scanlon.
I thank the Minister very much for giving way. I didn't read all the consultation responses, but I did look through the strategy. I don't think it mentions personality disorder. Will you be looking at, increasing your care, treatment and diagnosis for personality disorder?
If Mary Scanlon would bear with me, I will be coming to that very issue in my contribution. As well as the themes, we've identified 4 key change areas and I want to touch a little on each of them. The very earliest years, the period between pregnancy and 4 years of age, is a crucial period in shaping children's life chances. Secure attachment and with competent and confident parenting are significant protective factors, providing the child with confidence, resilience and adaptability. Poor attachment in infancy has been linked to a number of severe mental health problems in later life. Evidence-based parenting programmes such as the Incredible Years and Triple P are powerful ways of addressing and responding to conduct disorders. They produce long-term benefits to the child and to society. They take a positive and asset-based approach to strengthening parenting competencies. And NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde and Glasgow City Council are already in the process of taking making Triple P available to all parents in Glasgow. Additionally, through NHS Education for Scotland, we are starting a national rollout of Triple P and the Incredible Years parenting programme to the parents of all 3- and 4-year-olds with severely disruptive behaviour. Presiding Officer, I also want to see continued improvement across specialist child and adolescent mental health services. I'll briefly give way to my colleague, Ms McDonald.
McDonald.
I thank the Minister for giving way. As part of that, will he also consider looking at issues around postnatal depression and diagnosis of postnatal depression, which often can have the kind of impacts in relation to attachment, which can then lead to the disruption that he refers to?
Minister.
Of course, that's part of the wider holistic approach. It has to be taken to helping to make sure that we address issues that may affect a child in early years where a mother may find themselves experiencing postnatal depression. So, we've supported a 35% increase in the size of specialist CAMHS workforce since 2008. And as a result, there has been significant improvement in access to services. The latest data published shows that 89% of children and young people are being seen within the existing 26-week target, and that the average wait is 8 weeks. And the 26-week target is being replaced by an 18-week target, due to be delivered by the end of 2014. Finally, on CAMHS, one of the areas where we haven't seen the scale of change that I would have hoped to is in reducing admissions of young people to adult beds. There has been a progress across some parts of Scotland, particularly in the south of Scotland region, where development of new models of care in the community has created additional capacity in the inpatient unit, significantly reducing admissions of young people to adult beds. I want to see the rest of Scotland performing to a similar level. Another key area of change, Presiding Officer, is in the area of rethinking how we respond to common mental health problems. And an important aspect of addressing this challenge is in the way in which people have access to treatment services. Evidence already shows us that there is a significant level of health service delivery around psychological therapies, and that's why it's right that we should focus on improving this part of the overall system. And it is worth noting that Scotland is the only country to have introduced a waiting time in this area. We want a system where psychological therapies are readily available to those who require their support, but to also have a wider range of services available, from social prescribing, self-help and peer group support, to allow people to be able to get the service that best meets their needs to address their particular mental health issues. A well-functioning mental health system needs a range of community, inpatient and crisis services. And we've set out a range of areas where we intend to build on developments in services in order to make sure that we implement the strategy effectively. A strong message that came out from the consultation is the importance of employability. So someone being in the right work can actually have a real benefit to that person's life, their health and their quality of life and well-being. That's true of people with mental health problems too, and we want to see further progress in this area. There are also links within this. I'm very limited with time, I'm afraid, in this. And I want to try and cover the area I raised for
the Minister is concluding.
Yes. One of the areas where we do recognise there's a need for particular work is around the justice system. The report of the Commission on Women Offenders identified mental illness and personality disorder as a key contributor to women's offending and the likelihood of going to prison. We're building on this work that's already been undertaken in Compton Vale, testing the effectiveness of training prison staff in the use of mentalisation as an approach to working with women with a personality disorder or who have experienced trauma. And we're already extending that into NHS Lothian with a community-based personality disorder programme to see how we can then learn from that to roll that out naturally. In drawing my remarks to a close, Presiding Officer, I've not had an opportunity to cover all areas of the strategy here this afternoon, but I'm sure all members will recognise that good progress has been made in recent years in improving Scotland's mental health services, and the new strategy provides us with an opportunity to make sure that we build on the momentum that has already been achieved.
Thank you. We are rather tight for time in the debate. I now call Dr Richard Simpson to speak to and move Amendment 5444.2 in up to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I should draw attention of members at the outset to my membership of SAMH, the Scottish Drugs Forum, BMA, and fellowship of the Royal Colleges of Psychiatry and General Practice, and membership of the William Simpson Home. I very much welcome the Minister's tone today and the approach that he's taking of wanting to listen to other members. This new strategy for 12 to 15 I think is evidence of the government's ability to produce strategies which do listen to stakeholders, and I hope that they will also listen to the other parties today, because we are not intended to be highly critical of this report. This review, it's an excellent one. And it does build on the previous work that's been done by successive governments, the Mental Health Framework Report under 1997. But there is one difference, and that first framework was accompanied immediately by two things. One was a monitoring and supervisory implementation group, which meant that those in the field could actually see where the variations that the ministers mentioned are and could actually try and address these issues. And of course, the other good news at that time was it was followed by the Labour's doubling of NHS funding, something which is not open to this government quite clearly, and therefore the challenges are different. But that investment by Labour and the modernisation of the estate and the increase in mental health workers has changed the landscape. The number of beds has reduced. The old asylums are largely a thing of the past. Even the state hospital has been renewed and halved in bed numbers, with medium secure units being developed. Community care, intensive home treatment, crisis intervention have all increased, and particularly the level of readmissions, which I've put in my amendment, which I think the government takes some credit along with Labour on, that has reduced by 30%, which is no mean feat, but indicates the quality of the treatment that is being offered. So the SNP did inherit the service in a better place. One of the other factors external to the NHS was the positive reduction during our time of 1/3 in child poverty and also in pensioner poverty, nearly full employment. And these things all contributed, as we know, to a better place in terms of mental health. So one of the things is that I feel is that although the 36 commitments are welcome, one thing in the report which may reflect when it was drawn up is the fact that the challenges of a stalled reduction in child poverty, of 20% youth unemployment, the challenge of increased part-time working and higher unemployment generally, and the challenge of a reduced standard of living for all really does confront us in terms of where we're going to proceed in terms of mental health. And the Royal College of Psychiatry in their briefing does paint a somewhat starker picture for us. The contribution of suicide, drug misuse and alcohol, including the rapidly rising rates of alcohol liver disease, these contributing to premature mortality and other health inequalities in Scotland is now well recognised. And the poor general health of people with psychiatric illness, which is mentioned in the report, but includes their high rates of tobacco use, has become an increasingly evident as one of the causes of premature mortality. The impact of poor parental mental health, including substance misuse, does have an enduring effect upon the development of children. So I want to look, in the brief time I've got, at some of the pressure points in the system. Firstly, on health inequalities, which the Minister did mention, the reconstitution of the Health Inequalities Task Force, I believe, will be an opportunity to look again at the premature mortality due to poor physical health and excess smoking in those with mental illness, because this is a significant effect. up to 10 years loss of life expectancy for this group. So I hope that the Minister will assure me that that will be one of his priorities in the re-established Health Inequalities Task Force. In terms of the elderly, the government is to be commended on the building on the work by Aileen Oldfather and the cross-party group and Alzheimer's Scotland in adopting and pursuing an effective strategy in dementia, and I very much welcome this. But in the elderly, the Minister did indicate, but I think didn't emphasise enough, the fact that depression is actually 3 times as common as dementia. And indeed delirium is another important group. Depression in the elderly is estimated to have a prevalence of around 13.4% and is predicted by the World Health Organization to be the second highest health burden in the Western world by 2020 and is strongly linked to disability. And yet only 10 to 15% of these are treated. Unlike depression in younger adults, the presentation to psychiatrists is less and the presentation and diagnosis by GPs is less. Suicide rates in the elderly, unlike the excellent progress that has been made in younger adults, is almost completely unchanged over this 10-year period during which the heat target was there. And psychosis is also increasingly common because of the fact that we've got many more people over 85, and that group are associated with greater numbers of psychosis. But the biggest lacuna, I think, is the absence of a significant look at depression. And I think Malcolm Chisholm will mention a little more of this from the cross-party group meeting we had the other day. The main concern of addiction specialists are their expression about levels of alcohol consumption in the elderly as well, and that's another area that's important. And I felt that there wasn't enough attention to alcohol-related brain damage in all groups. This is a growing programme, and yet progress on achieving a joined-up approach seems to have stalled. Peter McLeod, in evidence to the Public Audit Committee in 2011, drew attention to this. And although there is some excellent teams like the one in Glasgow and support from groups like SAMH, Loretta Housing and William Simpson, there is not enough attention paid to this. Now, I did a case study showing that an ARBD sufferer had 11 separate case notes. That's not integration. It's an area that I would urge the government to have a further look at. On prisoners, Mary Fee will say a little bit more about this, but I do welcome the work that's being done in Cornton Vale and indeed extended to Edinburgh on borderline personality disorder. But unless we actually take the Angelini report really seriously across both justice and health, then we're going to be having this discussion in another 10 years. I was the Justice Minister when the Time Out Centre in Bath Street was set up to deal with people who primarily had a drug problem. It's never been extended, hasn't been tried for men, and yet many of the people in our prisons actually have drug or alcohol problems. We haven't tried this out for alcohol as well. This is a way we could reduce the prison population. We could actually reduce the building of new prisons by getting this group out of prison into treatment provision. On the child and adolescent mental health service side, the target of 26 weeks and the almost certain achievement of that is welcome, and the movement to 18 weeks I think is highly commendable, and the government have done a good job on that. There is a slight concern that the Mental Welfare Commission has expressed in their report indicating a flat lining of admissions to adult wards, around 140. It was that in 2009. It peaked and has come down again. I hope that's the start of a new trend, but I haven't seen any clear statement about the bed numbers. 42 going to 48 is in the strategy, but originally the agreement was 56, and I don't think that can entirely be removed by having intensive home care work. The other thing is that although the early years strategy is very welcome, Triple P, Incredible Years, all these things are really good and excellent, I think that we also need work in the primary schools, and groups like Place to Be, which provide a talking point for pupils who feel under stress in the schools, has been highly successful in Niddrie and Edinburgh, extended now to East Lothian and Glasgow, working extremely well. And this actually at a lower tier level will prevent the pressure on the CALM service and help the government to actually meet their target. It's not the only programme, but it's one that's worthwhile doing. On suicide, we're down by 16.7% towards the 20% target. Choose Life and See Me have both made a big contribution, and I welcome the Minister's announcement of refreshing the strategy. But we should recognise when we talk about percentages, that's still 770 deaths. That's a lot of deaths. So we've got 500 in drugs, 770 in this area and about 1,000 in alcohol. Those are three areas where we will need to renew our attention, renew our effort. Psychological treatments, again, the achievement of a target is extremely welcome, and although the online service by NHS 24 is useful, found particularly useful in the Highlands and Islands, face-to-face therapy is really needed. It's going to continue to be a challenge to meet that objective, but I agree the government's attempt to do so is great. But these are often people in work, and I think we need a flexible approach with appointments offered at times which are going to suit the workforce. Briefly, in concluding, Deputy Presiding Officer, I welcome the fact that we've now got a specialist community service based in Lothian for deaf-blind, but I would ask when the admissions to John Denmark unit in Manchester are going to conclude with the introduction of a unit in Scotland so that these individuals don't have to travel. One further question is, we haven't got the 2003 Act fully implemented, and I know we're going to look at tribunals and legislation shortly, but when will the government actually commence Section 268 of the 2003 Act, giving a right of appeal against overly restrictive detention in non-state hospitals? I think the time has come for that to be implemented. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would commend Labour's amendment, which I move, to the Chamber. Members will note that we have in essence drawn attention to one or two additional priorities, but not all, because we recognise the financial restrictions there are on the government. But we're not in calling for a clear timetable, supervised monitoring and implementation. Sam H make that same point, because only then can the welcome aspirations in this strategy be fully credible.
Thank you. I now call on Jim Hume to speak to and move Amendment 5444.1 in up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the opportunity to participate in this afternoon's debate in the week when the Office for National Statistics reveals a different figure on suicide than others have quoted, but an increase of 7.8% in the numbers up to 2011. So, but no matter whose statistics, it's still obviously a concerning issue. So it would be timely moment to have this debate, although it should be noted, and the Minister did note it himself, that the strategy, although very welcome, was published a number of months ago, and perhaps could argued we should have maybe discussed this at an earlier stage. I note the recent slight increase in the year up to September 2012 in the number of clinical psychologists employed by our health boards, and do commend the Government for that. The Scottish Government rightly recognised that faster access to psychological therapies is a key component in our efforts to tackle mental health in Scotland, and in particular assist in reducing Scotland's suicide rate, which is still a leading cause, no matter whose figures you take, of death for those under the age of 35. I will therefore welcome the decision to include access to psychological therapies as an 18-week referral to treatment heat target from December 2014. While the deadline for achieving that target is still nearly 2 years away, I was curious to see what the picture currently looked like. Indeed, so was Sam H, who have asked the Scottish Government to commit to an audit of current provision and of waiting lists for psychological therapies. Through contact with SPICE, I understand that no stats currently exist for waiting times to access psychological therapies due to delays and changes in personnel at ISD Scotland. So therefore I look forward to the Minister confirming in his summing up whether he will consider this audit and when ISD Scotland will be in a position to begin publishing these statistics. The Minister will be aware that 2 years ago the Coalition Government announced its own strategy backed by £400 million of additional funding to massively widen access to psychological therapies south of the border. The aim, and I trust it is one that would be supported across the Chamber, is to put mental health on a par with physical health in terms of the way it's perceived and treated, as well as ending the stigma attached to sufferers. Not only is this the right thing to do, but it will result in over £700 million of savings to the public purse, I should say. This is an example of preventative spending at its best, and one I hope the Minister is keeping a keen eye on. When it comes to accessing much-needed psychological therapy, I'm afraid there can be no doubt that something of a postcode lottery currently exists throughout Scotland. We're not talking about waiting for a minor operation or a routine scan. These are people often in desperate situations, experiencing real mental anguish, who need to be treated as soon as possible. But currently, the national average for the whole time equivalent figure of clinical and other applied psychologists is 11.3 per 100,000 people, with the rate increasing to 14.8 in Greater Glasgow and Clyde and 15.5 in Fife. But in Grampian, it's 10 per 100,000, 8.9 in the Highlands, and as low as 7.6 in Forth Valley. So living in Forth Valley with proportionally less than half the number of clinical and applied psychologists of your close neighbour in Fife, it seems to me to signpost a postcode lottery situation that I hope can be addressed. In my motion, I highlight the rise in the use of prescribing antidepressants in the NHS. There's no doubt that they are a worthwhile method of treatment for some and should continue to be used. But I'm concerned that we have gone from dispensing 1.26 million antidepressant prescriptions in 1994 to 5 million last year. Of course, there was, on that point, yes, of course.
Fiona McLeod.
About reducing the stigma of mental health. And do you not think it's very unhelpful to continue to refer to people taking antidepressants in this manner because it leads to the stigma? If someone had diabetes, we wouldn't have a campaign to reduce their insulin.
Jim Hume.
I couldn't disagree with the member, of course. But regarding antidepressant prescriptions, as I said, they've increased from 1.26 million in 94 to 5 million last year. And there was a previous government target to address this, which was quickly scrapped. I shall address this further in my summation. Sorry, yeah.
Minister.
I don't know if the member's aware that there was a change in prescribing guidance which was issued to doctors, which was to move away from using slow doses of antidepressants over a short period of time to using higher doses of antidepressants over a longer period of time. And some of the statistics he's referring to actually refer to the definable daily dose, which means it's not more people receiving the medication, it's actually the level of dose they're receiving is higher, which gives the impression that there are more people receiving the medication.
Jim Hume, I must ask you to begin to conclude.
Okay, yes. The strategy also highlights the people of, benefits of people taking unilateral action to improve their own well-being with physical activity, offered as one specific example. Mental health, I would say, is a growing issue at the core of the well-being of Scotland and one that we'll need to unite to address as a Parliament. I believe my Liberal Democrat amendment strengthens the motion so that we can move Scotland forward and away from any stigma of mental health, and move the motion in my name and would welcome support from all parties.
Thank you. And I now call on Nanette, Milne, 6 minutes.
Deputy Presiding Officer, for those of us leading busy lives who have little direct contact with mental health services or with people dealing with mental health problems, it's easy sometimes to forget that 1 in 4 of us will experience mental illness at some point in our lives. But this is a fact of life which we shouldn't ignore. And I, for one, am grateful to my colleague Mary Scanlon, who consistently keeps mental health issues in her consciousness during her daily work as an MSP, and has done a great deal to raise awareness of the difficulties faced by those trying to cope with depression and other mental health problems by bringing these matters to the attention of Parliament on many occasions since 1999. And I look forward to hearing her comments on the mental health strategy later in the debate. Organisations dealing with mental health issues like the Royal College of Psychiatrists and SAMH, the Scottish charity which does such a lot to promote the interest of sufferers and to raise the profile of mental health, have also worked tirelessly to encourage government to improve psychiatric services and to move mental health into the mainstream of health planning. So the publication of the Scottish Government's mental health strategy for the period between 2012 and 2015, building on delivery for mental health and towards a mentally flourishing Scotland, has been widely welcomed, and its implementation is eagerly awaited. The 7 themes, the 36 commitments and the 4 key change areas of the strategy make very interesting reading and are to be commended. But as SAMH says in its helpful briefing for the debate, and emphasised by Richard Simpson, the strategy runs only until 2015, and so an action plan for its completion is clearly needed, and a timetable needs to be in place for achieving its commitments. There is no doubt that significant progress has been made in recent years in improving mental health services and in reducing suicide, although every day 2 people in Scotland still die from suicide, emphasising the urgent need for effective and properly resourced crisis services within communities across the country. Presiding Officer, clearly in a 6-minute speech, it's not possible to deal in detail with such a comprehensive document. But I would like to touch on the 4 key change areas identified in the strategy, starting with child and adolescent mental health. It's now recognised that experience in the very early years of life has an enormous influence on later behaviour, and that poor parenting at this time can result in major problems throughout life. So the priority given in the strategy to early years and a focus on early intervention is very welcome, along with the commitment to making infant mental health training more available to children's services professionals and to increase the number of child psychotherapist trainees from this year. This, I think, should help to address the problems of those children where aggression, non-compliance and emotional issues are likely to persist, to cause school disruption, to cause family stress and dysfunction and mental health problems, which of course, as we know, may result in social isolation, drug and alcohol abuse and failure to gain employment, as well as eventually crime and antisocial behaviour.
Mark McDonald.
I understand the point the member is making. Often this can arise as a result of parental mental illness as well. And would the member not agree that perhaps categorising it as poor parenting is perhaps doing a disservice to those parents who find themselves in a position of suffering poor mental health?
Nanette Milne.
I absolutely agree with that. Perhaps my choice of words wasn't appropriate, but I think the member gets my intention. The sort of problems that I've been describing are a significant contributor to health inequalities. And as the Chief Medical Officer told the Health and Sport Committee just this week, most of the serious behavioural and mental health problems affecting young adults can be traced back to the first few years of life. The problems are complex, and their solution will require the coordinated efforts of the NHS, of local authorities, charities, and other third sector providers. Access to child and adolescent mental health services has taken far too long in many parts of Scotland, and the waiting times target, while still too long at 26 weeks, is welcome, as is the plan to reduce it down to 14 weeks from next year. The second area proposed for change is to rethink how we respond to common mental health problems, such as the impact of excessive alcohol consumption, debt, trauma, and distress on mental health. And there is a commitment to identify the challenges and opportunities linked to the mental health of older people, notably depression, which looks set to become a serious and increasing problem in the next few years of a rapid increase in the elderly population. Allied to this, of course, is dementia, and we look forward to an updated strategy on dementia as promised for later this year. There is to be more focus on personal involvement in improving mental health and a drive to encourage more people to become physically active, because research has shown a clear benefit to all health, including mental health, from regular, sustained physical activity. Other areas for action include the ongoing movement from inpatient to community-based services, proven to reduce admissions and readmissions, and the commitment to carry out an audit on those using inpatient services and why will hopefully result in further progress in this area. The Government's work for Armed Forces veterans is of increasing importance, as more of them return to the community from arenas such as Afghanistan and face the difficulties of integrating into civilian life after the ordered life of the forces. As I've learned from my membership of the cross-party group on veterans, mental health issues ranging from depression, alcoholism and post-traumatic stress are all too common in these people.
Dr. Milne, could you conclude, please?
I've dealt with targets in child and adolescent services. The other targets I would refer to are the 18-week referral to treatment time for psychological therapies, which is far from being achieved yet, and the one which is being achieved quite well in the reduction of the suicide rate. Presiding Officer, we welcome the mental health strategy for Scotland and are happy to support the motion today, but careful monitoring of the implementation of the strategy commitments will be important. The work done so far is commendable, but it is work in progress, and we will be following closely in the months ahead, hoping that the pace of change in mental health in Scotland will indeed increase as a result. Thank you.
Thank you. There's a number of members who wish to speak, so speeches of up to 6 minutes, please. Aileen McLeod, to be followed by Siobhan McMahon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And the motion before us this afternoon asks us to recognise the challenges that Scotland faces in tackling mental ill health, and they are considerable. The Minister in his opening remarks mentioned some of the key statistics that mental ill health is estimated to affect more than a third of the population at any time, and that while Scotland's suicide rate is improving, it is still slightly above the European average. There is also growing evidence of the role that environmental and social stressors play in mental health too, and the government strategy reflects, for example, on the comparatively high levels of mental illness that can be found in welfare benefits claimants. And I worry, indeed, I think we should all be worried about the impact that the new welfare reforms may have on those people. And I certainly fear that these reforms will see a further widening of income inequalities across the UK. And this matters. You know, in 2010, the British Journal of Psychiatry carried an article by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkinson reporting data that showed a range of health and social problems, including mental health, are more common in more unequal societies. And on Tuesday, we heard about the Citizens Advice Bureau funding suicide awareness courses for their advisors, and that is also highlighted in the strategy. And if we recognise the continuing and developing challenges in this area of policy, however, we should also recognise the positive achievements to date. And as I said earlier, Scotland's suicide rate has decreased over the last 10 years. And while I do agree that one suicide is one too many, I also think an overall reduction of 17% is noteworthy, although there is clearly some way to go to meet the 20% choose life target. In addition, Presiding Officer, I warmly welcome and have been delighted to support the SAMS H CME campaign, because one of the key factors, in my view, to securing meaningful long-term progress in delivering the mental health strategy is tackling the stigma that is sadly still associated with mental illness, since it can present a significant barrier to people accessing help when they need it. And this point is also made in the article that I referred to earlier. So I do welcome the prominence that the new strategy gives to tackling that stigma and the government's commitment to working with SAMH and other partners to keep pushing that agenda forward. And I also commend the strategy's recognition of the early intervention agenda. We all know the arguments that good parenting has a material effect on adult mental health, whereas poor attachment in infancy can be linked to severe mental health issues in adult life. And this is not simply an issue for our health service. It's one of the key messages that the late Campbell Christie urged us to recognise. Early intervention will only be successful if it is delivered at a local level with community planning partners and local authorities and other agencies, like local social work and education departments, will have a strong role to play, as they do in Dumfries and Galloway, for example, where the Incredible Years parenting training referred to in the strategy is being made available to the parents of vulnerable 3-year-olds. Now, the inclusion of a commitment on social prescribing is also welcome in my view, and although we should be clear that mental illness is no different to other forms of illnesses and that where medication is required, it should be prescribed, and we should also investigate the possibility that there are other forms of therapy which may be effective. Now, preparing for last week's debate on biodiversity, I read SAMH's submission on the 2020 biodiversity targets, and it reflects on the impact that physical activity can have on promoting good mental health and improving the quality of life of people who do experience mental health problems, as well as the importance of natural environments as part of that therapeutic benefit. And in the stewardship in South Scotland, which has a significantly higher than average elderly population, a social prescribing project joint funded by NHS Dumfries and Galloway and the local authority is looking at reducing the level of prescribing of antidepressants through other forms of therapeutic provision. And I hope that the government, as part of the Commitment 15 in the strategy, will have a look at what that project delivers and how it may link to the quality ambitions and core themes in the strategy. And for my part, I hope the project will be able to realise some of SAMH's ambitions about the use of nature to help promote mental well-being. Presiding Officer, a further welcome inclusion in the government strategy is consideration of the issues specifically relating to veterans. And I'm aware, for example, that the First Base Agency in Dumfries raises around £10,000 a year to pay for 2 half-days per week of psychological therapy for veterans who've come to them looking for help. Now, clearly, this is a valuable service that's being funded through third sector action, but there must be a better way of funding that provision. And the Ministry of Defence, I would argue, has a level of responsibility in this area because it can and should be making the very modest funds available to support people who have served this country under its direction and who now suffer mental ill health as a result of their experiences. To conclude, Presiding Officer, the mental health strategy represents a valuable opportunity to take stock of what has been done to date and also to include developing policy themes for the future. Fundamentally, however, it also represents this government's commitment to providing high-quality mental health services, and it is, in the best sense of the phrase, very much a work in progress and one which I am pleased to support, and I support the motion in the name of Michael Matheson.
Thank you very much. I now call Siobhan McMahon to be followed by Dennis Robertson.
A report produced last year by a group of Scottish GPs who compared notes on the impact of welfare reform in some of the most deprived areas in Scotland identified one overriding issue: a huge increase in the number of patients presenting with deteriorating mental health. These patients fell roughly into two groups: those who had previously been well but were suffering from anxiety and depression due to job insecurity and financial pressures, and those who had been receiving welfare payments due to poor mental health, only to see those payments removed on reassessment. One GP described the test his patients were subjected to as unnecessary and avoidable. Another described the decisions reached as medically inappropriate. The report did not only reveal a systematic failure, it uncovered a startling absence of understanding and imaginative sympathy. This lack of compassion for mental illness is not confined to the welfare system. It permeates society on both sides of the border. I welcome the Scottish Government's recognition of the severity of mental illness and its subsequent commitment to improving Scotland's mental health, as outlined in its Mental Health Strategy 2012-15. As the strategy states, whilst we have made great strides in recent years, there is still much to be done. I'm sorry, at the moment I can't. And if we were to make those improvements, it is essential that we listen and act upon the advice of medical professionals, mental health charities and service users. Additionally, we must endeavour to ensure that national strategies, such as the Mental Health Strategy, are adhered to both in word and action. In January 2011, NHS Lanarkshire published Modernising Mental Health Services in Lanarkshire, a set of proposals aimed at rebalancing the delivery of mental health services away from institutional models and towards community-based provision. The proposals are thus aligned to the long-term trends articulated in the Mental Health Strategy. The proposals recommended reducing the number of psychiatric beds by consolidating acute inpatient mental health services at two dedicated facilities, one in North Lanarkshire at Worcester General, where an IPCU ward would also be situated, and one in South Lanarkshire at Hare Myers Hospital. These wards would be fully equipped and resourced to provide complex treatment and care. The proposals were influenced by an extensive consultation process encompassing health professionals, local and national politicians and umbrella bodies representing service users. The Scottish Government is also fully behind the plans, with the former Cabinet Health Secretary Nicola Sturgeon stating that she was content that NHS Lanarkshire proceed to implement its proposals to modernise mental health services across the border area. One individual who vocally opposed the proposals was the MSP for Airdrie and Shotts, Alec Neil, and I'm sorry he's not in the chamber at the moment to hear what I'm about to say. The proposals were due to be presented to the NHS Lanarkshire Board in September 2012 for approval. However, this didn't happen. When I investigated, I was told that the new Cabinet Secretary for Health, the aforementioned Mr Neil, had asked for some time to review the proposals. On the 26th of September, Mr Neil confirmed the delay in this chamber, stating that NHS Lanarkshire is revising its original proposals for mental health services at Monklands. When I wrote to Michael Matheson, whom I was advised had ministerial competence on this issue, to query this apparent U-turn, he informed me that the Scottish Government had some reservations about NHS Lanarkshire's proposals. On the 19th of December, I asked Mr Neil in this chamber when he or any other individual acting on his behalf had last contacted NHS Lanarkshire regarding the provision of mental health services at Monklands Hospital. He told me he had decided early on in my tenure to give responsibility for that matter to my deputy Michael Matheson, as I did not want any perception of any potential conflict of interest between my role as MSP for Airdrie and Shotts, where Monklands resides, and my role as Cabinet Secretary. I have since seen an email from the Deputy Performance Manager at the Directorate for Health, Workforce and Performance regarding the decision to delay the modernisation of mental health proposals. The email, which was sent to the Head of Communication at NHS Lanarkshire, states that Mr Neil has confirmed that he is reviewing the proposals before a decision is made, and that decision will be made soon. That was sent on the 15th of September 2012, less than 10 days after Mr Neil was appointed Cabinet Secretary. To recap, Until September 2012, when Nicola Sturgeon was replaced as Cabinet Secretary for Health by Alex Neil, NHS Lancashire's modernisation of mental health proposals had the approval of the Scottish Government. Then, Alex Neil took over, expressed reservations, and a decision deferred whilst NHS Lancashire revised the proposals at the behest of the Cabinet Secretary. I find this turn of events both confusing and frustrating, and I am not the only one. I received a letter from Frances Fallon, Chairperson of Lancashire Links, written on behalf of mental health service users in Lanarkshire, expressing great disappointment at the Cabinet Secretary's decision to intervene to delay the proposals. The letter refers to the rigorous consultation that informed NHS Lancashire's modernisation of mental health proposals which Lancashire Links supported. The letter states that what is most important is that all decisions are taken in an open, honest and informed way. It closes by asking, why are we now being ignored? Very good question. Attached to the letter are the views of some of Lancashire Links members. One individual sums matters up perfectly. 2 years of consultation and hard work have been turned round and we are back to square one. Presiding Officer, NHS Lancashire officials devoted time, effort and expertise to producing and modernising mental health proposals. They consulted widely. Health professionals agreed with the proposals, service users agreed with the proposals, Nicola Sturgeon agreed with the proposals. But Mr Neil did not agree, and because of that the plans were shelved, apparently indefinitely. We are now left to ask, does the Cabinet Secretary agree with the fundamental components of the mental health strategy, or does he favour a piecemeal approach wherein a strategy is adhered to or ignored, depending on who is Cabinet Secretary for Health at any given time? To quote one disillusioned member of Lancashire Links, can we get a straight answer from Mr Neil?
Many thanks. We're very tight for time today, so contributions of up to 6 minutes would be welcome this afternoon. Call Dennis Robertson to be followed by Mary Fee, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'll try and accommodate and be as brief as possible. It is a privilege, I think, to take part in this debate this afternoon, and I sincerely hope that my contribution will be one of positivity. Presiding Officer, the mental health strategy is to be welcomed, and there have been great strides towards the improvement of people's mental health. There's still a lot to be done. We all acknowledge that. And I think the strategy itself, and the Minister has certainly acknowledged that. Dr Simpson mentioned that the depression amongst the elderly quite often is linked to disability. And Dr Simpson is absolutely right. And having spent over 30 years working in that field, I know that appropriate social care and intervention at the time can actually provide very positive results, especially for those occurring with sensory impairment, who can find that quite confusing and debilitating. But with the appropriate social care, and this is where I believe that when the health and social care integration actually takes place, people like the elderly suffering depression will have the facilities and the resources at hand to provide the services they need at the time of need. To pick up on a point that Jim Hume made with regard to the number of antidepressants being prescribed, I actually feel there's a degree of positivity with that. Now, that may sound strange, Presiding Officer, but I believe that the number of antidepressants being prescribed is perhaps as a result that more people are coming forward because of the stigma has been removed. More people, and I think through the NUS, and I congratulate the work that the NUS do with students, etc., bringing people through very difficult times during exams and various other problems that many students actually have in their lives. But the fact that they perhaps turn to an antidepressant to enable them to cope is perhaps a good thing, rather than try and hide the symptom and bury their head in shame, because it's not a shameful thing to be mentally ill. It has been said that one in four will occur some degree of mental health or illness in our lifetime. Presiding Officer. Yeah, very briefly.
Jim Hume.
I thank the member for taking the intervention, but with the amount of antidepressants that are used at the moment, and I take it it's not just used for antidepressing problems, but at the moment we have 1 in 10 of Scots who are actually using antidepressants.
Mr Robertson.
Thank you very much. I think given the Minister's explanation to Mr Hume earlier and my own, I think perhaps Mr Hume maybe needs to revisit this in his own thinking. Presiding Officer, it will come as no surprise to this chamber that perhaps part of my contribution will be related to the experience that myself, my family and others have endured due to things like symptoms like eating disorders. Now, I've had very positive meetings with the Minister regarding the pathways for people with eating disorders and the services that are there on offer. However, it would appear that, Presiding Officer, that sometimes things are slow. Movement is slow, but that's okay in terms providing we're going down the right pathway. The Minister linked into families and carers. It's extremely important that the appropriate services are there for families and carers, because it is the family and carers that generally have to cope with, and cope with quite often without the knowledge or awareness of what they're supposed to be coping with. And, Presiding Officer, this is where there's a mismatch. The link isn't really there yet. The link of working with the patient, prescribing to the patient, providing the appropriate therapies to the patient, that's fine. That's excellent. That's to be commended. However, we must include at all times, in all stages, the families and carers if we are to see movement and success in terms of treatment for people with say, eating disorders, and indeed many other mental health issues. In this chamber earlier on this week, in fact just yesterday, Presiding Officer, Alex Johnson brought before the chamber a members' debate on cyberbullying. But bullying across the whole spectrum is unforgivable, distasteful, but it needs to be addressed. But bullying causes itself mental health problems. And again, we need to tackle that. And although we were tackling the work that goes on in the internet and social media like Facebook, for instance, we've actually got to look at the media, such as the television, and how they promote certain programmes just to get viewing numbers up. Going home the other night, Presiding Officer, after the debate, I switched on the television, and in Channel 4, there was super size versus super skinny. Versus super size versus super skinny. It's not a game. Far from a game. They use headlines. They use things to get viewing numbers up. Programmes like that, and I have actually approached the producers of that programme before regarding the title of the programme and suggesting that perhaps they need to disengage from that title and look at another way of portraying this. We are not there to glamorise mental health and mental illness. There are people genuinely suffering and looking for solutions, Presiding Officer. And we need to ensure that the media don't get their numbers up as a quick fix in respect of that. I commend the work that is happening within the government at the moment. Thank you. I commend the work that is happening with the government at the moment, and I think the strategy is on the right path. And I look forward to further meetings with the Minister in tackling eating disorders in a very positive manner. Thank you.
Thank you. Many, many thanks. Now call on Mary Fee to be followed by Christine Graham. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would like to welcome the Scottish Government's mental health strategy. However, I do strongly feel that some issues around mental health and specific sections of the population have been massively overlooked or go unrecognised. The last time I spoke during a debate on mental health, I put a particular focus on children. And today I'll continue the subject of children and mental health with a greater emphasis on children of prisoners as well as prisoners themselves. Now, I welcome the recognition around mental health and offending in the strategy. However, the focus is primarily on women offenders. Now, I'm not complaining that this often forgotten section of the prison population has been highlighted, and that's thanks to the report of the Commission on Women Offenders. And I was pleased to hear in the Minister's opening remarks his mention around women offenders. But the strategy misses the glaring fact that 94.7% of those in prison are male. Commitments 30 and 31 both target female offenders, and Commitment 32 looks at community payback orders. This shows that either there is a lack of will to address the mental health of prisoners, or it's not fully acknowledged that if you tackle the mental health of prisoners, then you're on a strong foot to reducing reoffending. Tackling mental health in prison is a complex process, and made all the more complex with an ever-increasing prison population and overcrowded prisons. Presiding Officer, it's estimated that 90% of prisoners have some form of mental health problem. However, that figure was estimated by the Office of National Statistics in 1997, based on a review of English and Welsh prisons. And it would be hard to argue that that estimate then does not still apply to today's prison population. I recently asked the Scottish Government for the number of self-harm cases in Scottish prisons from 2008 to 2012. The answer from the Cabinet Secretary showed that reported, and I stress reported, self-harm incidents increased by 62% over 4 years. Yet the 2012 figure only included incidents from January to November. So it's likely the final figure will be higher than the 244 cases reported in the first 11 months of that year. And given the increase in self-harm, the fact that 9 in 10 prisoners have mental health issues, and the complexities in tackling mental health in prison, I am disappointed that the strategy barely scratches the surface of the issue of mental health and offending. There is also a serious issue that the Government do not know how many prisoners in Scotland have mental health problems and what treatment they are currently receiving. The gaps in information held on prisoners are extremely concerning and does little to improve the mental health problems inside Scotland's jails. So while the Government laud their own strategy, they have sidestepped a section of the population where poor mental health is high and disproportionate to the rest of Scotland. Presiding Officer, as I stated earlier, families of prisoners are often victims as well. The statement is even more significant for children of imprisoned parents. Families outside report that 60% of all women in prison have children, and there are 2.5 times as many children of prisoners as there are children in care. Yet little attention has been given to the children of prisoners who can or do suffer health problems that affect their development or behaviour. Of course, there may be some looked after children in care as a result of a parent's imprisonment. So the 2012 to 2015 strategy targets those children. However, this is at the exclusion of other children of imprisoned parents. Evidence shows children of imprisoned parents are more likely to become offenders themselves later in life. This is attributed to poor mental health as a result of If it's very briefly, I will give way, yes.
Dennis Robertson.
Very briefly, and I thank the member. Would the member acknowledge that perhaps GIRFEC might actually pick up the needs of those children, given that it's getting it right for every child?
Mary Fee.
I acknowledge the member's comments, and I think GIRFEC does go a long way to support children, but there is a huge amount of work that is still to be done in recognising the children with mental health problems that need help and support. Evidence shows that children of imprisoned parents are more likely to become offenders themselves later in life, and this is attributed to the poor mental health as a result of parental imprisonment, leading to developmental and behavioural problems, further restricting the future social and economic prospects of each child. However, the strategy has no mention of children of prisoners and their mental health. The CAM's targets may include children of imprisoned parents, but this group of children are often as isolated as looked after children with similar behavioural and developmental issues. Given the Government's focus on early years and reducing reoffending, it is beyond belief there is no specific action or commitment to improve the mental health of these children. Children who have a parent or even a relative in prison often experience feelings of worry, shame, anger, fear, depression, grief and burden. These feelings can attribute to poor mental health of children in most cases, but are more commonplace in children of imprisoned parents. There is also a serious concern about the stigma attached to these children, so I must stress the importance of promoting the well-being of prisoners' children. The Early Years Agenda promotes the idea that children must be supported to become successful learners, effective contributors, responsible citizens and confident individuals. And on the basis of the 3-year strategy, we have missed an opportunity to tackle the poor mental health of these children. Finally, Presiding Officer, the Royal College of Psychiatrists has welcomed the waiting times for CAMs. However, I have to agree with them that no child should be waiting up to 6 months to access mental health services. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Now calling Christine Graham, followed by Linda Fabiani.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm going to focus on mental health and the wider criminal justice system, and I'll try not to duplicate the well-researched contribution by Mary Fee. I would also like to recognise the previous expertise and the commitment of the Minister, who was previously within the Justice brief, Dr Richard Simpson, also previously in the Justice, and of course Mary Scanlon, who we know has been committed to this right since 1999. And for those who are just new to the Parliament, I think it's necessary to repeat that. We've already heard how many people are within the prison system, but look at the broader criminal justice system. I think something we tend to forget is many victims of crime have mental health problems. In fact, it's reckoned that they're 11 times more likely to be a victim of a crime. And of course, sometimes there's hardly a sliver of difference between who is a victim and who is the perpetrator. And sometimes, indeed, they're one and the same person. I remember in evidence the committee, somebody in the judicial system saying it just matters who got the knife out first, which side of the fence you were on. So it's very hard and very wrong to categorise people into straight categories. And of course, people come up against the police when they have mental health problems. The police have come a long way to training officers, but there are still issues about recognising whether somebody is not on their medication and why they're aggressive and so on. So that remains an issue to be addressed. And then the person with a mental health problem may enter the court system. And again, staff throughout the court system need to be trained in recognising and dealing with people with mental health issues, whether they're in the dock, they're a witness, or they're just accompanying somebody. That's another issue. At prisons, we already heard from Mary, if he's quite right, overwhelming number of people in prisons have mental health problems. Sometimes drug and alcohol related, and it's caused it. Sometimes the mental health problem came first. Sometimes it's a bit of both. I have to say that the improvement that's taken place by the NHS taking over the delivery of health in the prisons is important. Recent visit to Pullman told me that. That started, there were a little bit of teething problems at the beginning. People were changing from being employed by the SPS to being employed by the NHS, but I think it was a good move. Now, we have to also bear in mind, and somebody's alluded to this, that in the majority of prisons are in Scotland from poor socio-economic backgrounds, where again there's a higher prevalence of mental health problems and drug and alcohol misuse. So it's a very complex issue. I'm going to briefly deal with Corton Vale and women prisoners. Again, that's been dealt with well. I have to say real progress is being made, and I don't use the word progress lightly. There's real commitment from the Governor, from the Government, and from the Chief Inspector of Prisons and the prison officers themselves to change what happened in Corton Vale. And of course, we have now had the announcement that the new prison in Inverclyde will be adapted and allocated to be the new prison for women in Scotland, specifically to deal with them, many of them victims themselves, and of course just coming back into the system because there's not the proper through care, and I'll come to through care. Because one of the things that I think that is, we know this, we've known this for 12 years in here, and it's utterly depressing, it's getting a bit better. But what happens is that we have people in prison, they have a structure, their mental health problems are perhaps dealt with, their medical problems, things with their family, you name it, and prison officers are doing their very, very best. And the minute they come out of prison, it stops. Now, you and I couldn't deal with that. How can they deal with it? A simple thing like releasing people on a Saturday, when the benefits office isn't open, if they're going to get any benefits, when the housing office isn't open, and so they're left cast out. Now, when we visited 218 in Glasgow, the provision for women trying to be rehabilitated from Corton Vale, we were told a very simple thing. Somebody was at the prison gate to meet the woman on release, to take her somewhere, to make sure she had her benefits, to make sure she hadn't lost her tenancy because she'd been in prison for 6 months. She had somewhere to go, somewhere to help her, very basic. Now, we can't do that for every prisoner. There's nearly 15, very briefly.
Robert Campbell.
Would the member accept that we heard evidence at the Justice Committee of a byproduct of the NHS taking over medical care in prisons was it gave the potential for an improved through care system?
Well, what I will say is with 15,000, I'll come to that, with 15,000 prisoners being released every year, we can't have somebody meeting up the gates every time. But here's a very simple thing that we found out in a visit to Pullman, and I'm sure Richard Simpson and others will recognise this. Many of them coming out simply don't have a GP. So their medical records, or mental health, physical well-being, all the good work that's been done in prison, lost to the winds. They come out, there's nothing to meet them. Now, you can't impose GPs on people, but surely to goodness, we can find a system where prisoners on release, there is somewhere to go, somebody to help them to go, to ensure that the medical treatment, physical and mental, continues once they're released. That's me finished. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now call on Linda Fabiani to be followed by Mary Scanlon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Successive Scottish administrations and this Parliament have made mental health a priority, and we have made much progress. And this continues with this strategy, which is to be very much welcomed. There's two areas in which I want to focus today, and they're inextricably linked, and that is stigma and self-esteem. When you look at stigma and what goes along with it, the bullying, the humiliation, whether it's depression, bipolar, psychosis or schizophrenia, whatever, whether it's one-off, periodic or ongoing, these are the effects, marginalisation and isolation. And that does terrible, terrible things to people. Can you imagine if it presents itself in childhood or adolescence, what a legacy someone has to carry into adulthood when they have suffered stigma and its associated problems for so many years. That's why the work of See Me is so very, very important. I think they do tremendous work. And I don't think there's anyone in this Parliament who hasn't at some point taken part in an event through the See Me campaign and been very, very impressed by the work that we do. I also believe that if we can alleviate the stigma along the way of eradicating the stigma, then this would have a direct effect on well-being and on self-esteem. And I don't think we should ever underestimate the value of self-esteem and well-being. That was brought home to me a few years ago very clearly by the work of the East Kilbride Dementia Carers Group. And it was watching the joy of dementia sufferers who, even for a short time each day, took part in something that made them laugh, made them smile, made them feel good. And it may have been that, later that evening they wouldn't even have remembered or been able to tell their partner or daughter or son what they'd been doing, but they felt quite good, and that's really, really important. So what helps promote well-being? What helps promote self-esteem? I would say it's participation in creativity, the arts, drama, song, dance, culture, participation in lots of these things. And that's not to deny necessary medications and treatments, but rather to enhance, to maintain, and in some cases prevent progression. The work of Theatre Nemo is well quoted in regard to the use of drama and the arts in the health and justice services. Nemo began its life in East Kilbride but has expanded through its work and recognition awards and is now Glasgow-based. We heard Mary Fee and then Christine Graham talking about the justice system and in prison, and back in a Herald article, actually, last summer, Governor Derek McGill claimed that at that snapshot in time of a prisoner population at Berlin of around 1,100, as many as 260 could be classed as having mental health problems. There are people here, he said, who are mentally ill, but not so ill they should be in a hospital. If we can stabilise them, get them taking medication and improve their self-esteem, there is less chance they will reoffend when they go back into the community. One of the Theatre Nemo participants can be quoted as saying, working as a team, knowing you can contribute to society and create something positive, can see yourself in a new light as someone with strength and skills. And a lot of good work has been done in Leverdale, Roundbank, Stobhill, Southern General, Gartnavel and Carstairs. Over the years I've attended many Theatre Nemo events, and it's been an absolute privilege over these years to see perhaps someone who the first time I ever saw them was standing on the sidelines, slightly away from the crowd, watching with a bit of disdain or a bit of shyness what was going on. 3 or 4 years later, going along, and In fact, it happened recently. There this person was in front of the choir singing at East Kilbride Arts Centre. That is wonderful. The self-esteem that that brings is absolutely tremendous. There's been a long history of creative arts in helping people adapt to or recover from mental disorder, and there have been many academic studies on the subject too. Back in 2003 to 2005, there was the Arts, Creativity and Mental Health Initiative, and it evaluated 4 arts therapies trial services across sites in Scotland. And in a summary of the project, Dr. Andrew McCulloch, who was Chief Executive of the Mental Health Foundation, said, "The art therapies have a valid therapeutic role, and arts and health projects can improve the resilience of individuals and communities. The findings showed that overall participants experienced significant improvement in their mental health and social functioning, and in particular highlighted improved self-esteem and communication skills and social interaction." So that further emphasises the need to actively reduce the stigma associated with mental ill health. Society has overcome other deeply ingrained prejudices, and we have to keep working on this one. I'm pleased to see, for academic and practical reasons, that our mental health strategy has commitments, Commitment 4 and Commitment 15, working with CME and increasing local knowledge of social kinds of activity, social prescribing to help with these things. We need more of that. I believe that both of these commitments work towards both the prevention agenda and joined up policy implementation. And I look forward to that implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Mary Scanlon to be followed by Fiona McLeod.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to thank Nanette, Milne and Christine Graham for their kind words. I have indeed had an interest in mental health since coming here in 1999 when I was Deputy Convener to Adam Ingram. In the first 2 sessions of Parliament, we worked very well together on this topic. I welcome the mental health strategy. It is progress and it is a step in the right direction, but I also welcome the review of this progress in 2015, following the introduction of the 18-week waiting time target in 2014. I'd just like to put on record, as others have said, the tremendous work done by so many in the voluntary sector to support people with mental health issues and to address stigma, in particular SAMH, Depression Alliance, the Samaritans. Their website is wonderful, even telling you how to approach people that you feel with depression, which I think many of us are nervous about, and many, many more. And like others, I welcome the 34% increase in the CAMHS workforce and the waiting time target of 26 weeks for CAMHS to be introduced this year. I would like to think that the Minister will now be looking at increasing the psychology workforce now in preparation for the December 2014 target. And whilst I note that waiting times are down, it's only 3 years ago since people in Easter Ross were waiting 4 years and 7 months to see a psychologist. And like others, I welcome the progress on improving dementia diagnosis, but I would also like to see improvements in treating dementia. The sign guideline for dementia is now 7 years old, despite sign reviews generally being done every 3 years. The Mental Welfare Commission confirmed to the Health Committee, where Christine Graham, Richard Simpson and indeed the Minister was on the Health Committee, that 75% of people in care homes were being given psychoactive medication for sedation and behaviour control, when the sign guideline states antipsychotic withdrawal should be considered in patients who are stable. I actually find 75% of that population very serious. It wasn't mentioned today, but I trust the Minister will mention it again. And I would also like to ask, as the Health Committee asked then, for a more consistent review of medication for older people. Not only could this save money, but it could also improve health. The Health Committee recommended that pharmacists or GPs visited care homes on a more regular basis to review the medication of elderly people. I recently became aware of a woman in her late 80s, 87, and her daughter said to me, Mary, she's on 8 different types of medication, And she's taken them at all different times of the day, you know. And she says she was on HRT for menopausal problems. Now, the woman is 87, but she was also on antidepressants. So she said to her, "Mum, I didn't know you were depressed, Mum." Oh, she says, "I was feeling a wee bit down when your brother was born." Well, the brother was over 60, you know. And so I don't think that's an unreasonable comment. And I think you might find that right across Scotland. So given that 43% of people on benefits in Scotland have a mental health issue, then it's right that we give more time towards it. And 79% of people with a long-term mental health problem are not in work. I thought the points that Siobhan McMahon and indeed Aileen McLeod made, and I think Siobhan McMahon's point about the work capability assessment, I'm not sure what time she was referring to, but I can say that Professor Harrington has looked at fluctuating conditions, for example, ME and mental health, and he has taken that into account during the assessment. I actually welcome the Welfare Reform Act because many people with long-term mental health conditions, I do feel, need the 2 years of support that is given in order to get them back into work. The strategy also mentions treating depression in those with long-term conditions such as diabetes. Now, my understanding, and the Minister could confirm this, is that support should be given for depression in many, if not all, long-term conditions. But the treatment of depression is rarely mentioned and indeed rarely addressed in SIGN guidelines. And I'd just like to come back to Jim Hume's place because, I mean, I think I understood very well what Jim was saying. Early diagnosis and treatment of depression is essential. And when we look at CBT, which, as Richard Simpson mentioned, has been a wonderful success, particularly in the Western Isles and the Highlands, but NHS 24 did carry out a review on cognitive behavioural therapy, and what they did say was it was only effective in those who were given an early diagnosis. For those with severe chronic and enduring depression, it had no effect at all. And I think Jim Hume, his point was there is a place for antidepressants, but there are also times that there is a place to refer on to specialists and also to look at the talking therapies. I'll just move on very quickly. The Audit Scotland report overview of mental health services 2009 states that 75% of people with a drug addiction, 75% have an underlying mental health problem, and 50% of people with an alcohol addiction may have a mental health issue. And there is no point in treating the addiction unless we treat the underlying mental health problem. So just finally, Presiding Officer, I accept what the Minister said on borderline personality disorders. I would like to ask him if he would continue to inform the Parliament, because I am aware of what some families go through in order to get a diagnosis and in order to get the very complex treatment that's required.
Thanks very much. I now call on Fiona McLeod to be followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want to confine my remarks to mental health problems in older people. Dementia is very much the headline mental health problem for those who are older, and we have the very welcome and very well received dementia strategy. But as Richard Simpson explained in his opening remarks, there are more older people experience mental health problems such as depression and anxiety than suffer from dementia, and I'm in no way playing down the worries of dementia. I have a huge number of statistics here to give, but given the pressures of time, we will go with the statistics and figures that Dr Simpson mentioned earlier. But at this point, I would like to turn to some of the remarks that Mary Scanlon has just made and make it absolutely clear, and it is not a laughing matter, that if someone in their 80s needs antidepressants and may have needed them for 60 years, then they need them. It's not a laughing matter. But as I've said, many older people experience mental ill health.
Mary Scanlon.
I do apologise if I gave the wrong impression. The point that the lady's daughter made was that her prescription had not been reviewed in 60 years. That was the point. and she only had depression after a child that was 60 years old.
Fiona McLeod.
Given that we're very short of time and that I've already cut my speech, I'm hoping that perhaps the Minister will be able to respond to some of that, which was nonsense. Can we talk about why older people suffer from mental ill health? There are a number of reasons why that is happening increasingly. We talk about multiple morbidity nowadays, and it is a fact that many of us are living longer, but we're living longer with ill health, and that ill health can often be mental ill health. There's a lot of people living in loneliness and isolation, and there's a lot of people living with financial worries. And this is a very serious problem in the elderly. And just one fact that I want to give, and it is building on something that Dr. Simpson mentioned. In the age group of older men aged over 75, it's the highest incidence of suicide in any age group. It's 11% higher than we have in young men, and we do have recognised that we have a problem in suicide with young men, but that is a startling fact that we have to bear in mind when we're talking about the mental ill health of older people and the consequences of that ill health. I did have a lot of facts and figures, which I haven't been able to read out, but I would like to thank Dr. Gillian McLean, who's a consultant in old age psychiatry, who gave a very powerful and very informed presentation to the cross-party group on mental health last week. So what can we do about mental ill health in the elderly? One of the first things that we have to look at is the diagnosis of ill health in the elderly. And again, can I refer to the success we've had in diagnosing dementia here in Scotland, world-breaking numbers that we now have of diagnosis, and we need to take that forward into diagnosing other mental ill health in the elderly. We need to raise awareness that this is a real problem in the elderly. There's lots of neurobiological changes as we grow old, and they can affect our mental ill health, and we shouldn't just accept that growing old biologically brings things like anxiety and depression, and that's just a fact of old age. We must move beyond that. There's also multiple medications that people are taking nowadays, and we have to be aware and train our medical workforce, but I think also carers, to be aware that each time perhaps their mother or their father's prescription is changed and added to watch out for signs where this could be impacting on that elderly person's mental ill health. And there's a lot of masking of mental ill health in the elderly. Things like UTIs, urinary tract infections, can give confusion, etc. But we mustn't always say that when an old person is confused and forgetful, that it's a UTI or it's dementia. We should be exploring to make sure that it's not a mental ill health and perhaps not just part of natural ageing, cognitive decline. But we should also be alleviating external factors that can affect depression and anxiety in the elderly. I talked about loneliness and isolation of the elderly, and I would say that that's perhaps one of the contributory factors for why that we should continue to have concessionary bus fares for the elderly as one way of alleviating that isolation. I also talked about financial fears, and they are genuine and real. Old folk have always worried about the pennies, but nowadays with the welfare reform, cuts coming down our way, with Labour's talk about cuts commission and a something for nothing society, I think we can move away from that sort of language and realise the effect that we're having on people. I would like to have had time to talk about social prescribing and the physical activity that Sam H with their Get Active programme talked about, but perhaps can I leave us on one of the messages that came out of the cross-party group last week is that clinical services need to be delivered not on an age basis in terms of mental health, but on a basis of needs of your mental health. And I hope that this mental health strategy will lead us to be able to live long and happy lives. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now call on Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer, the first thing I noticed when I read this strategy was the amazing contrast between the completed strategy and the draft strategy that was issued a few months ago. And I don't say that in a spirit of criticism, because it probably means that the government was listening, which is not always the case when consultation documents are issued. But if I can look at Key Stage Area 1 to start with, we can see last time there was very little about the wider work of the Scottish Government on the early years, and there was an almost exclusive focus on the CAMS specialist area. Now it's almost the opposite, to the extent that certain key CAMS issues are ignored. And one highlighted, for example, in the Royal College of Psychiatrists paper to us today is the need for an adolescent intensive psychiatric care unit. But the one that I was more struck by was the complete absence of reference to integrated care pathways for child and adolescent mental health. And the reason I was surprised was it was mentioned in the last document. When I talked to a child psychiatrist, she said, this is absolutely crucial, and you must say implementation support is absolutely essential for integrated care pathways. But this time, they're not mentioned at all. Now, I don't say that in a carping criticism, because I do very much welcome the wider early years agenda that is highlighted and given a prominent place in section or key change area 1 of this document, because surely a preventative population-based approach to mental health is particularly crucial in the early years. And I have to give credit to the government more generally for having recognised that. And of course, the Minister highlighted that both in the way in which he pointed to the importance of attachment, but also, of course, by the references he made to such programmes as Triple P and the Incredible Years, which are evidence-based parenting programmes which the government is quite right to roll out. So I think there are a lot of quite interesting and exciting things going on in the early years. And the latest, of course, today is the first meeting of the Early Years Collaborative. And having seen these in action in health, I know they can work. I believe it will work in the early years. And I hope Sir Harry Burns is right when he said today it may have the butterfly effect. He's usually right, so I hope he's right about that. Last thing on child and adolescent is picking up what Richard Simpson says. Let's not just do the early years to the age of 3 or 5. Work in schools is important. I've seen place to be in Forth View Primary School in my constituency, so I certainly support what Richard Simpson said about that. Now, moving on to key change area 2, I like the focus on common mental health problems such as anxiety and depression, including in older people, and I welcome the fact there's now a separate section for older people, which I think wasn't there in the draft document. And of course, for these commonplace or more commonplace problems, people can benefit not just from access to psychological therapies, but also from physical activity, as Aileen McLeod emphasised, and also from social integration. And here I would like to highlight a really excellent project in Edinburgh called Community Connecting. It's been run by Health in Mind, although it's now going to be run in my area by the Plenary Development Project. And basically, it focuses on certain older people who have issues of isolation and possibly depression and other mental health problems connected with that. It pairs them up with a volunteer for a period of, I think, 4 months. And certainly the evidence is that it has had a remarkable effect on quite a few older people in Edinburgh. So that's a really good example of the wider mental health agenda for older people working. Now, of course, Richard Simpson said I was going to say more about this, but he said most of it. So, but the fact of the matter is it was highlighted in the cross-party group on mental health last week. And I will give one statistic which really surprised me, and I think I've got it right because I checked it. Dr. Gillian McLean, consultant in the Minister's own Health Board area, who said that 1% of people, older people who go with depression are referred to a psychiatrist in secondary care, whereas 50% of people, that does seem a high figure, but I think that's what she said, of adults would be referred to a psychiatrist. There's certainly an amazing gap there, so that a lot of older people who should be referred are not. And one of the issues, perhaps not with psychiatry, but certainly in terms of clinical psychologists, which she highlighted, is that there are a lack of clinical psychologists who specialise in the care of older people. So there are some issues there, but credit to the government for having recognised that and having a section in the document about it. Now, key change area 2 also deals with trauma and distress, and Dennis Robertson, both today and Tuesday, of course, highlighted him, and we know that he can speak more from experience on that than anyone about the importance of eating disorders, so I won't say more about that. But in terms of trauma, I did recently visit the Edinburgh Women's Rape and Sexual Abuse Centre, which does really important work in counselling for women who've suffered the trauma of rape, and I highlighted in a previous debate the funding problems there. So I think we have to look at these wider support services for people who have gone through trauma. Now, I've only got one left for key change areas 3 and 4, so I'm going to start talking a bit faster. 3 crisis services are really important. Sam H has said they need to be rolled out across across Scotland. I can certainly vouch for the fact they've been really important in Edinburgh. The crisis centre is actually based in Leith. It was campaigned for a long time by users of mental health services, so that's a great model that we want to see more of. Prisons is covered in key change area 4. Mary Fee has dealt with that, but one issue certainly in relation to prisons is the lack of advocacy, and I'm still concerned that there is nothing that I can find in the document about advocacy. I think I asked Nicola Sturgeon a question about this when the draft strategy came out, and my memory seems to tell me that she said it would be included. Well, I can't see it, and of course it was an issue from the McManus review, so it's supposed to be carrying forward on that, and perhaps the Minister in the winding up can tell us what's going to happen about the new further legislation on mental health. But I've got 6 minutes, so it's a good point on which to end.
Many thanks. Now calling Kevin Stewart to be followed by Mark McDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've had many tributes to mental health champions in the Parliament today, people who not only take part in debates in this chamber, but actually continue the good work out with this chamber. And I would like to pay tribute to one of my former colleagues in Aberdeen City Council, Councillor Jim Kiddy, who served in the Milan Commission on Mental Health and who has tried to create mental health champions out of almost everyone he meets. And it is people like Jim, I think, who have led us to a place today where we recognise that we still have challenges, but where we have a mental health strategy which I think is pretty good. And, you know, listening to Malcolm Chisholm there saying a difference between the draft and the final strategy, I'm quite sure that Jim Kiddy was probably one of the folks who was in communication to say that he was not entirely happy about certain aspects of the draft. And I would also like to pay tribute to the many groups and volunteers that work throughout Scotland, helping folks who have mental health difficulties. This Monday, I had the pleasure of having tea with a Friends group in Aberdeen, entirely voluntary run, and, you know, making a huge difference to people's lives. And I think that organisations like that, who often operate in a shoestring, are to be praised for the efforts that they make. Presiding Officer, we have heard about health inequalities, and I think it would do no harm to reflect on the Audit Scotland figures from October 2012, which said that people in deprived areas have lower overall mental well-being and more GP consultations for depression and anxiety, 62 consultations per 1,000 patients compared to 28 per 1,000 patients in the least deprived areas. Suicide rates are 3 times higher among men than women and over 3 times higher in the most deprived areas. Between 2007 and 2011, the suicide rate in Scotland was 26.4 per 100,000 in the most deprived areas, compared to 7.1 in the least deprived areas. Now, many people will say to me, Presiding Officer, that I come from a very rich city. But in Aberdeen, we have poverty amidst plenty. And, you know, I think that we really do need to make sure that tackling these health inequalities are a priority. And I'm pleased that the Minister, in his opening speech, said that that was ambition of the government. But my great fear about the situation that we currently are in is that welfare reform will have massive impact in sometimes the most vulnerable people in our country. And I think I will give way to Mr Robertson, Presiding Officer.
Dennis Robertson.
I thank the member very much for giving way in this point. The member is probably aware that many people going through the welfare reform have to go through appeals, and they're subjected to rigorous questioning. Quite often these people have identified mental health problems, but they don't seem to be taken into cognizance during the appeals process.
I thank Mr Robertson for that contribution, and I would agree with him. And in evidence at the Welfare Reform Committee just this week, a representative of the Scottish Independent Advocacy Alliance said that their staff were having to do much more work to help folk through these processes. The lady gave an example where a client in East Ayrshire had to attend tribunal or appeal in Ayr. And that was basically an entire day for the advocate that went with that client. And I think that we really need to ensure that those folks who are carrying out work capability assessments and the appeals recognise that some folks have real mental health difficulties. And unfortunately, I don't think that is always taken cognizance of. Having gone with colleagues Alec Johnson and Michael McMahon to see an ATOS assessment, one where an actress replaced the client, and a very good actress she was as well, but it gave us a feel for the process. Now, I think that process would be pretty scary for many people, but for people with mental health problems and learning disabilities, I think that adds an additional strain. And I have a great fear that we may see deterioration in people's health because of the processes that are currently in place. And I heard Mary Scanlon talk about the Harrington reviews, and I think that has made things slightly better. But I think there is still a massive room for improvement in that area. And I hope, Presiding Officer, that will be looked at more carefully. Thank you.
Many thanks. Now call on Mark McDonald to be followed by David Stewart. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And can I begin by absolutely associating myself with the remarks of my colleague Kevin Stewart in relation to our former council colleague Jim Kiddie. I think, having spent 5 years in the council chamber at Aberdeen, anybody who'd ever listened to Councillor Kiddie speak on mental health issues and indeed his own personal experiences, which he's extremely candid about, it cannot help but raise the hairs on the back of your neck to listen to his experiences. And I think one of the things that Councillor Kiddie emphasised to me very early on and has stayed with me since is that mental illness is something that can affect anybody at any stage of their life, irrespective of their status or indeed their general health and well-being. And I want to cover a number of different areas, and I've got a lot to get through, so hopefully I can manage it within the 6 minutes. The first thing I want to look at is an issue which I've raised in a couple of interventions, and that's the issue around parental mental health, which I think is an extremely important issue that needs to be borne cognizance of. And I did pull Nanette Milne up on the use of the phrase poor parenting, and she accepted that was poor phraseology. But at the same time, there is a perception that exists out there that a result that child mental health issues or child behavioural issues stem from poor parenting. And sometimes that is indeed the case, but in many cases it is a result of attachment issues that develop as a result of parental mental health issues, including but not exclusive to postnatal depression. And it's worth noting that postnatal depression affects around 10 to 15% of women, and currently it is estimated that for every 1,000 live births, 100 to 150 women will suffer a depressive illness. But it's also worth noting as well that studies have shown that it is estimated around 10% of fathers can also develop and suffer from symptoms and effects of postnatal depression, and that is something which we should also bear in mind. And I noted a 2008 report, the effectiveness of interventions to address health inequalities in the early years. One of the issues suggested for further research was further exploration of interventions that reduce risk for postnatal depression, because it is recognised that that has an impact on the mental health and well-being of children in the early years. And I would welcome comments from the Minister in relation to how the government sees postnatal depression fitting into the mental health strategy, particularly in relation to the application of the Edinburgh scale for postnatal depression, because I understand that it is expected that all women should receive the Edinburgh scale, but I have anecdotal evidence that there are some women who've later been diagnosed with postnatal depression who say they did not given the Edinburgh scale to complete, which I think is something that may not be widely prevalent, but it's maybe something that needs to be re-emphasised either to health visitors, GPs, or indeed both, that they need to be taking cognizance of the Edinburgh scale when it comes to looking at women and women's health postpartum. I also want to look at environmental factors, and a number of colleagues have spoken about welfare reform and also wider recession. And the GPs at the Deep End report from March 2012, GP experience of the impact of austerity on patients and general practices in very deprived areas, makes, I think, for very sombre reading. A central concern of the Deep End practices is the number of patients with deteriorating mental health. And they looked at two ends of the spectrum. At one end, those who are in work and previously well, who found themselves under increasing stress at their own jobs due to potentially cutbacks and job security, taking on extra work or jobs with resultant impact on family and relationships. At the other end of the spectrum, there are those with chronic mental health issues and established physical problems who are deemed fit to work and have their benefits cut. They found these people struggling to make ends meet, increasing contact with GPs and psychiatry, increasing antidepressant or antipsychotic use, and self-medicating with drugs and alcohol. And a number of the testimonies that were borne out in the report, one GP saying, "I observe this again and again, that I cannot address medical issues as I have to deal with the patient's agenda first, which is getting money to feed and heat." Another said, "In my surgery, I'm hearing from patients who for 2 to 3 days a week cannot afford to heat their houses. Many use metered cards, which are more expensive than direct debit payments." And then a kind of gallows humour comment, which says, "For obvious reasons, the patients in practice X or area X call Corona House, where the work capability assessments are done, Lourdes, because all the sick come out cured." And I think that emphasises that the work capability assessments are not necessarily taking cognizance of some of these very real issues. The Royal College of Psychiatrists also state recessions have been shown to be accompanied by an increase in suicide rates. The people most at risk of suicide at this time are those who are experiencing financial problems. And I think that the evidence from the Centre of Welfare Reform, which showed that 45% of people in debt have mental health problems compared to 14% of people who are not in debt, they also produced a hypothesis which said that poor mental health is linked to real poverty, and I think that has been borne out by some of the evidence as well. And there's also an issue there around the pressure that will be experienced on the front line. And at the Finance Committee in June of 2012, I, at the time a member of the Finance Committee, asked questions of Dr. Margaret Somerville from NHS Highland, who said, "I have not talked much about mental health issues, but we expect an early impact on mental health services and particularly on primary care services. Again, we need community resilience and support. Uncertainties and unknowns produce stress in people, which leads to depression and anxiety. That will have an impact on primary care and on our mental health services." And that shows clearly that there will be an impact on services as a result of welfare reform. Very briefly, Presiding Officer, on stigma. It still exists in many ways, which makes people more reluctant to come forward, particularly depending on the walk of life in which they operate, in which they work, because they consider that it will have an impact on their job security. We must do all that we can to tackle stigma, and I think that the mental health strategy will play a strong part in that, and I very much welcome it.
Many, many thanks. Now call on David Stewart to be followed by Roderick Campbell. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In the early 1980s, when I was a fresh-faced social work student, hard as that may be imagined now, I was in a Stirling GP surgery waiting room. On the wall was a striking poster by the Health Education Council. It pictured a young woman with a bright smile, a perfect complexion, who radiated health. The caption read, "6 months after Mary had a nervous breakdown, her friends are still recovering." And I think Mary had a lot in common with Winston Churchill, Florence Nightingale and Gandhi, who all suffered from episodic mental illness. In Roy Jenkins' seminal work on Churchill, Sir Winston described his depression as the black dog, which was perhaps not helped by his legendary drinking. I'd like to focus, a bit like Mark McDonald has done, on the stigma surrounding mental illness, illustrated by a couple of examples from my own experience as a mental health officer, looking at the social and economic implications and, of course, touch on best employment practice. Before I move on, Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government paper on mental health strategy for Scotland, I would say, is a well-researched and well-argued document, and I would certainly support the 3 quality ambitions of person-centred, safe and effective, and, of course, the 7 themes, particularly the anti-stigma work and the work of the Scottish Human Rights Commission, who promote rights for those who suffer from mental illness. I support, of course, the 2016 standard for 18 weeks between referral and commencement of treatment. Now, previous speakers, Presiding Officer, have rightly pointed out that mental health problems cause considerable poor health in Scotland. And the World Health Organization, as we've heard from previous speakers, estimate that 1 in 4 people will have a mental health problem at some time in their lives. But the Audit Scotland overview of mental health services reports that depression and anxiety combined is the most common mental health problem. For example, the Scottish Government Information Service estimate that 300,000 Scots take antidepressants on a regular basis. And Audit Scotland highlights that socially excluded people are of greater risk of developing mental health problems. Perhaps to paraphrase Nelson Mandela's famous line, while social exclusion persists, there is no true freedom. And I think Kevin Stewart got it right when he said that there are higher levels of mental health problems in deprived areas, that suicide rate for people living in deprived areas is 4 times that of the most advantaged areas. And the Office of National Statistics reported in 2004 that nearly half of all the looked after children by councils have mental health problems. The Scottish Exec in 2003, as Mary Scanlon correctly said, that 3/4 of those using drugs, half of those with alcohol problems, have mental health problems. And many members have reported the Scottish Association of Mental Health study, which showed that the social and economic problems of mental health will reach 10.2 billion per year, up 25% since 2004-05. So what's the solution? Well, I'd like to highlight the groundbreaking work by BT, whose mental wellbeing strategy has led to a 30% drop in mental health-related sickness absence and more people returning to work after absence. And what about a personal view of mental illness? Well, Lindsay Patty gave evidence to my petitions committee in November. She has a mental health problem. She said in evidence, and I quote, "We need to address the stigma of mental ill health. From a young age, children are taught social education, starting with relationships in primary schools and going right through to drugs and alcohol in secondary schools. I feel that mental health should feature more heavily in such education, with the correct facts being given. I find it amazing and saddening that so many people have the wrong facts about mental health. Words such as psycho are used daily in newspapers for no other reason than to describe a footballer making a bad tackle. Just yesterday, I heard a news reporter calling a news story bonkers and someone else being called a loony because they've a different opinion. Where there's a murder, people automatically assume the person is mentally ill," unquote. My own experience as a mental health officer in the mid-80s was that services were hospital-centric and the spectrum of overall healthcare, mental health was the Cinderella service. I still remember working in the locked ward in Craigdanian Hospital in Inverness, a Victorian institution, watching electroconvulsive therapy given to an elderly patient. I had nightmares for weeks afterwards. But of course, there's been a major shift to community-based and person-centred care. And I'd like to highlight in particular the excellent work being carried out by the Choose Life team. Prior to joining the Parliament, I worked closely with the Highland team leader and saw first-hand the excellent training carried out with nursing, police and local authority staff in the field of suicide prevention. And we know from the Royal College of Psychiatrists briefing paper, as we've heard earlier, that the economic cycles give a clear indication of suicide trends. But I was struck by the comments from Royal College that older people experience more illnesses, such as depression and anxiety.
I wonder in relation to the Choose Life programme, the figures have improved in terms of the number of NHS staff being trained, but it's still only 52%. And I wonder if he agrees with me that actually we need to push on with further training for all staff associated with the public sector.
David Stewart, you must close.
I would strongly agree with the points made by Richard Simpson. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I welcome the Scottish Government's strategy for mental health for Scotland. Campaigning for improvement for mental health services is to lead a crusade for social justice and inclusion and to champion the fight against the tyranny of stigma of mental illness.
Thank you very much. And I now call Roderick Campbell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity to speak in this debate and to follow so many thoughtful contributions. Mental health is affected by an extremely broad range of factors, many of which, of course, are interconnected. The reasons behind mental health problems we face as a nation are many and varied, and that was why it's clearly right that the Scottish Government launched the consultation to update the Government strategy, and I'm pleased to hear from the Minister as to the strong response to the consultation. In relation to suicide, I recognise that progress has been made in the last decade, however, but I think we should bear in mind other evidence, academic evidence, from Edinburgh and Manchester universities last year, publishing research which identified something called the Scottish effect. That is, the phenomenon that causes suicide rates in Scotland to be higher than elsewhere in the UK. One of the authors of the report suggested that a more prevalent tendency in Scotland to treat symptoms of mental health with psychotropic drugs rather than getting to the root of a patient's anxiety or depression could be partly to blame, although it was not clear to the researchers whether this tendency was caused in the seeking of treatment or in its delivery. There is, of course, good evidence, anecdotal and otherwise, which suggests that the use of psychotropic drugs can have seriously unwanted side effects. And I'm very pleased that prescription of antipsychotic drugs for the elderly, particularly those with dementia, is now being actively discouraged. The paper also suggested that alcohol and deprivation had a significant role to play in the Scottish effect, being responsible for 33% and 24% of excess suicides, respectively, excess meaning above the UK average. Sadly, the paper also identifies men as being at a greatly elevated risk. Indeed, the Scottish Suicide Information Database published a report in December 2012 which suggested that in the latest figures, 3/4 of suicides involve men, and in 2010, 56% of those who committed suicide had received mental health prescriptions in the year leading up to their death. The link between increased suicide risk and poor mental health is beyond question. We know that. David Stewart and others have referred to the Choose Life initiative, and I think these are helpful in beginning to make inroads against the Scottish effect, but we need to keep working at this. Several speakers have referred to the impact of welfare reform and the impact of recession. We clearly need to acknowledge the scale of the recession's impact on mental health. A recent research paper published in the British Medical Journal is one of several in recent years whose conclusions suggest an increase in the prevalence of mental health problems, which seem to align with the onset and development of the recession. In fact, several papers published in the last 2 years appear to indicate a growing problem, and some academics are investigating why it is that men appear to suffer more negative mental health effects than women as a result of the financial crisis and recession. Although we all know, of course, that women are suffering from the UK coalition's policies in plenty of other ways. The paper says that further research is needed. No doubt that is the case. We need to explain the effects on men, but it's also increasingly clear in modern medicine and psychology that gender, as well as age, employment status, physical health, and many other variables, demand a mental health strategy which is centred on patient needs. I'm pleased that the government's strategy contains measures which does, I think, help to deliver a more patient-centred treatment, and I certainly strongly support efforts in that respect. In our debate in September 2011, I touched upon the value of peer groups as a form of independent advocacy and as an aid in the recovery process. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government has committed in Commitment 3 to review peer support, and I acknowledge that that is a step in the right direction. Hopefully, peer support will become much more important in the future. A lot of speakers have referred to stigma. I, again, welcome the Scottish Government's commitment to the development of the See Me campaign. But I think we should bear in mind that a survey conducted by See Me last year suggested that 56% of people still wouldn't want anyone to know if they were suffering from a mental illness. Research shows sufferers are often reluctant to talk about it with others, whether it is because they're worried about people's perception of them changing for the worse, or because they're embarrassed, or because they simply do not want to become a burden on family, friends, or colleagues. Mental illness has been described as the last great taboo, but we must do all we can to destigmatise it. There are signs that progress has been made, and we can be encouraged by international reaction to some of our efforts. See Me has, of course, been lauded as an example of best practice internationally, and statistics show Scotland has progressed a great deal in the last few years when it comes to tackling stigma. The perception that depression is a sign of weakness can impede, of course, as other speakers have said, a sufferer's professional and career progression, or make life difficult in a number of other ways. And it's still depressing to note that the See Me survey suggests that only 35% of people think it would be suitable for someone to be a primary school teacher if they experience depression from time to time. These and other forms of discrimination must continue to be tackled. I think we're heading in the right direction to change attitudes for the better, but we have a long way to go. In relation to older people, finally, I was also at the recent meeting of the CPG, and I can confirm, I think that Malcolm Chisholm is correct, that we did hear evidence that only few, in fact, I think it was fewer than 1% of older people with depression were being referred to psychiatrists. We also had evidence that there were not enough clinical psychologists dealing with non-drug treatments, because that's wider than older people.
I'm afraid I must ask you to close.
And we also learned of the frustration felt by some elderly folk that mental health services for the elderly concentrate on dementia without perhaps recognising the range of mental illnesses that elderly folk encounter. I'm glad to see that the strategy takes that on board. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call on Jim Hume, up to 6 minutes in the winding up speeches.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've had a good debate. I think it's been a very fruitful debate this afternoon. But of course, we still have challenges. Dennis Robertson rightly highlighted that 1 in 4 adults in Scotland will experience mental ill health at some point in their life, with the resulting socio-economic and personal cost of mental health problems estimated to be in the region of £10.7 billion annually. And with mental health now the dominant health problem of people of working age, the cost to employers, of course, is now in excess of £2 billion a year. But of course, the emotional cost to families is even greater. And I think perhaps all of us have been touched in some way with mental health issues in families. That is why I welcome the publication of the strategy and its important commitments. Kevin Stewart mentioned the many champions that have been mentioned. Maybe one that should have been mentioned was Tommy Whitelaw, who cared for his mother with dementia for many years and witnessed her writing down her name, her date of birth on her arm, just to hide the fact that she was suffering from dementia. And he's taking his Tommy on tour around Scotland, spreading his good word. I highlighted equality in access to psychologists. There are more than twice the numbers proportionally of clinical and other applied psychologists available to treat a patient in Kincardine than there is for a patient 3 miles away in Clackmannan. And so there is such an inequity, and I think that's worrying, and I would like to see a commitment from the Minister in his summing up, perhaps, that alongside meeting the heat target by December next year, he'll ensure that that disparity is some way addressed. As stated, there are no stats currently existing for waiting times to access psychological therapies due to delays and changes in personnel at ISD Scotland, and accept that infrastructure needs to be in place to collect the relevant data, but waiting times for psychological therapies was approved as a heat target over 2 years ago, and we should by now have an idea of where we are at. And again, I would appreciate maybe that point being addressed, whether in summing up or later. And in my opening remarks, I noticed the increase in use of antidepressant, and notes the Minister's points, and of course Dennis Robertson's with his remarks and experience. But Mary Scanlon maybe highlighted the point that I was at least trying to make, that there's no formal process to support GPs to review patients with common mental health problems. And I firmly believe that the Scottish Government should perhaps work with health boards to roll out nationwide successful pilots, such as the one in Glasgow, where Greater Glasgow and Clyde reviewed patients on long-term antidepressant use. In 78 participating practice areas, patients on antidepressants for over 2 years had their cases reviewed. The results were 28% of patients had a change in their therapy, ranging from dosage changes, alternative drugs, or stopping altogether, and this led to a 9.5% reduction in prescribed daily doses, not to mention, of course, most importantly, better patient treatment. My overriding concerns, and I know they're shared by others, are firstly that the use of antidepressants has increased because of lack of alternative availables to GPs, for example, in flexible exercise referral schemes not available during working hours, or the perception that waiting lists are too long and inaccessible. And of course, as Linda Fabiani eloquently remarked on, alternative therapies. And I do completely understand that antidepressants are something used to treat conditions, not just depression, but other conditions, and that we do need to use them. But it's a sobering thought, I think, that 1 in 10 Scots are being medicated antidepressants. SAMH have been mentioned by many and their good work in highlighting physical activity and addressing stigma and other mental health. Their See Me campaign, mentioned just about by everybody, has done great work by entering into a partnership with SAMH with PFA Scotland to challenge that stigma associated with mental health in the likes of football community. And in 2011, See Me produced 5 excellent short films to coincide with Scottish Mental Health Week. A well-produced video, which I'd recommend members to watch. Linda Fabian, as I said, mentioned the creative alternative therapies, one that the Minister knows I've had an interest in with the Postnatal Depression Borders organisation, who the Minister gratefully agreed to meet with just a couple of months ago. So I was appreciated that. We have seen a real terms cut in the budget for physical activity, which is disappointing, and I would say it's a good example of preventative spend that this government could take up. So perhaps the Minister could also mention that too. Suicide rates have been mentioned by many, and I think Roderick Campbell also gave some extra facts and figures on that. So I think we shouldn't be complacent and be too excited about the strategy stating that these figures are going down. It's still a major concern. Presiding Officer, the Liberal Democrat amendment in my name notes the concerns of a steep increase in use of antidepressants, addresses ways that this government could address that, including talking therapies, notes the huge investment by the UK government to address access to psychological therapies, recognising mental health as an issue at the core of Scotland flourishing. I therefore would welcome support from across the Chamber to show Scotland that this is an issue we take seriously above any party politics. Thank you.
Thank you. And to now call on Jackson Carlaw, up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin, as Richard Simpson did, by actually welcoming the sober assessment and tone of the Minister in his introduction to the debate much earlier on this afternoon. I thought it was sober. I thought there was a candid assessment. We know there is a strategy in place. We know that much has been advanced, and all this is widely welcomed, and it has enjoyed cross-party support. But I thought the way in which there was a recognition of the progress that needs to be made in a whole series of other fields facilitated what I thought was a debate punctuated by very specialised and informed contributions on specific areas throughout the afternoon. Richard Simpson himself made particular reference to the challenge of an ageing population. I thought coupled that in all its forms, and I thought that it was the in all its forms aspect of that it's easy sometimes for us to pass over and simplify. He also talked about the incidence of adolescents in adult wards. And I thought maybe it was being a little bit optimistic and hoping that there was an alternative trend being established. There was a spike and we have got it back to where it was, but it's kind of where it was. And I think for me to be confident that we maybe have a new trend established, we want to start seeing it drop a little bit below that. And I know that the plan is in place, and I take the point that Richard Simpson made about there not being as many beds as was hoped, but we know that it's not ideal, and the Minister himself, I think, recognises that that is progress we want to see going forward. Jim Hume, I suppose the major stooshy of the afternoon centred around the introduction of the issue of antidepressants as characterised by Jim Hume. And I kind of understood where he was coming from. I looked at the Minister, and it's perfectly true that the defined daily dose has gone up from 88.4 to 120.9. But I mean, the number of items dispensed has also gone from 3.5 million to 5 million. So I don't want to sort of simplify the argument, but there is somewhere in that a concern. And it's a concern which has to go beyond Fiona McLeod shaking her head and calling anyone who addresses it as talking nonsense. And that is, we don't want this to become something upon which we rely as the methodology for treating people. And so it's got its part to play. It would be very reckless and foolish to suggest it hasn't. It may even have a part to play as an increasing incidence of it being prescribed. But we want to know that there is something parallel in addition to that, and I think that's the point that people were trying to articulate. Nanette Milne touched on the suicide rate. The Minister had done so too. The fact that it is falling, I thought that kind of contradicted Mark McDonald saying that in a recession there was an inevitability to the fact the suicide rate would increase, because that is actually not the experience. But the SAMH campaign, Too Many, is not something we should forget or ignore. It is actually, if we just stop and think about it, 2 people who are losing their lives by their own hand on a daily basis. And that ought to chill us in its individuality and in the effect that that has on the families concerned, on those around about them, and on the loss of potential in life that it involves. Now, Siobhan McMahon's speech was in two halves. She had a rather personalised contribution that was being addressed to an empty chair, but I hope that the note of what she had to say was nonetheless taken account of. But Siobhan McMahon and then Aileen McLeod, and also, I think, later on, Kevin Stewart, in the second half of his contribution, touched very specifically on welfare reform. And this isn't a debate about welfare reform this afternoon. But I want to try and answer it in two ways, and I hope that they balance as a piece. Some of the assessments we're talking about were introduced by the last Labour government. Nicola Sturgeon, at the beginning of this Parliament, said to the Health and Sport Committee she supported the principles of welfare reform. Now, there is a paint your bandwagon approach here. You can hitch your caravan onto the end of any bandwagon and start complaining about the consequences of it. I think there is an acceptance that welfare reform is something which this country needs to face up to and address just now. But let me also then, as a Conservative, say that is not the equivalent of me being comfortable as an individual with the consequences of the assessment process on the lives of some individuals. And therefore I accept some of the comments and criticisms that have come from that. I think Harrington has made progress. Is it enough? No. I hope more lessons can be learned. But I don't think that in itself is an argument for us to say welfare reform has got no place. And if we are not going to support individual welfare reform proposals, then they have to be matched with alternatives. But I accept it with an acceptance that not everything that is happening is something I can stand up and applaud or support or say is an acceptable process or outcome. Mary Scanlon's point, and she and Malcolm Chisholm, I think, were able to illustrate with a long perspective and understanding of this, that we can welcome all the progress that's being made, but in a whistle-stop tour of the issues, nonetheless throw some grit into the porridge and make sure that we are still prepared to probe on the individual things that are being proposed, without that necessarily becoming a confrontational or a polemical exercise. And I think for as long as we are mature enough to accept that there will always be areas where progress is not being made, even while in other areas progress is being made. It's not a failure of any party political progress. It is a failure of our ability to make progress simultaneously on all fronts. Can I say to Kevin Stewart, I thought it was an uncharacteristically understated contribution from Mr Stewart this afternoon. I very much enjoyed it. Nanette Milne beside me said that she thought that Councillor contribution had been immense, and therefore I'm happy to endorse that as well. And then very late on, I think the other characters of the debate was the issues of stigma, which were touched on by Linda Fabiana and others at the end of the debate. It was a constructive debate this afternoon, and actually punctuated with some very well-informed contributions. And I think those concerned with this condition can be satisfied in the knowledge that the experience and interest is widespread across this chamber.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Jackie Bailey with up to 8 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And let me agree with Jackson Calder. I think this has been an absolutely interesting and largely constructive debate. And I have to say, with all due respect to my front bench colleagues, this debate has been owned by the back benches. There have been incredibly impressive and informative contributions. I don't want to pick people out, but Mary Scanlon, Mary Fee, Linda Fabiani, Dennis Robertson, and I think Kevin Stewart and Mark McDonald will both be quite surprised that I have mentioned them too, because we don't often agree. But on this issue, I thought they made really impressive contributions. But as ever, whilst we acknowledge the achievements and the progress made by the government and by the NHS and all the partners, it is always the case that we can and should do more. So my comments are set in the context of that broad support. And can I echo the Minister's praise for all those who do work in mental health, the health service staff, those in the voluntary sector who on a daily basis provide care and support for those with mental health problems. But let me start where Richard Simpson did. We are, irrespective of political colour, good at producing strategies. Our shelves are indeed littered with them. This mental health strategy rightly commands positive support across the chamber, but we do need to make sure that it's implemented so that it actually makes a difference on the ground. And that is the challenge, not just for government, but for all of us too. The Minister also told us about a new dementia strategy, a refreshed suicide and self-harm strategy. Both welcome, but again, we need to be sure of implementation. So can I ask the Minister to give serious consideration to setting up an implementation group with a clear action plan, monitoring framework and a timetable for key milestones so we can measure progress? Because let's make sure that this strategy isn't destined for the shelf, but actually does lead to change. Nanette Milne rightly reminded us that 1 in 4 of us are likely to suffer from mental health problems at some point in our lifetime. Mental health used to be regarded as very much a Cinderella service, and I think the collective efforts of the Parliament and successive governments has changed all of that. But I am concerned that in a time of austerity, the clock gets turned back. There are, in many communities across Scotland, cuts in social care services. In others, charges have been introduced for the first time. This applies to mental health services too. It is the case that I know of constituents who are faced with losing a service or paying £50 a week for the first time to retain provision that was for them essential to their mental health and well-being. And at a local level, parts of my constituency in Helensburgh didn't have access to crisis services after 8 p.m. at night because of a lack of resource. And Malcolm Chisholm rightly drew our attention to the value and importance of crisis services in his own constituency. So we do need to be vigilant. We all recognise the importance of community-based services, often much preferable to inpatient care, as it supports people to continue with their everyday lives. But let's make sure that they are adequately resourced. Jim Hume raised the question of statistics when discussing child and mental health services, and I want to welcome the government's HEAT target of referral to treatment of 18 weeks and the progress outlined by the Minister. But it is still the case that there are children being admitted to adult mental health wards, which I'm sure we all across the chamber agree is entirely inappropriate. We do need action to tackle this, and I would press the Minister to ensure that there are sufficient CAMHS beds available, and I do know that he is committed to making progress on that. But Jim Hume made a point about the lack of statistics, although I know that the Minister was able to give us some, and I think he said that 89% were meeting the CAMHS target. But you know, when we asked SPICE what the statistics were, what they told us was that there weren't any statistics, and therefore we were unable to measure progress. Now, this is a critical area of policy. So can the Minister advise when the data will be available? And does he agree with Sam H's call for an audit? Because I think if we establish our baseline position, we can then effectively measure the progress made. And I think that's a useful tool for us all, including in government. Can I turn to Mary Fee's authoritative contribution on the justice system and the impact on families of offenders, complemented very much by Christine Graham's contribution too. Mary Fee is right to point out that the serious omission in the mental health strategy, that there is no mention of the very real challenge for and impact on children of having a parent who is an offender. Now, in the past, in a previous life in government, we've used supplementary reports to pick up on areas that needed further development. And I would genuinely invite the Minister to do just that and make sure that the mental health support for children of offenders is very much part and parcel of the mental health strategy moving forward. Many members across the chamber spoke about early intervention for children. McDonald indeed raised the issue of postnatal depression and support for parents because of its impact predominantly on women, but also on men and on children too. And we support the very many positive things that are being done by the government. The Triple P programme and Incredible Years, and as children move to primary school, the Place to Be programme. And we welcome continuing investment in that. Linda Fabiani, Roderick Campbell and many other members talked about the importance of tackling stigma and about the extremely positive work of Simi and Sam H in challenging this. And again, we commend their work to the Chamber. But I want to turn to an area that certainly I had occasion to visit, and that's NHS 24 and their CBT services mentioned by Mary Scanlon. When I visited the project at the Golden Jubilee Hospital, I was struck by just how flexible the project is, but how it was making a huge difference to people predominantly in rural areas where individual telephone support was essential to their improved mental health and well-being. And I think the statistics that we were starting to see were extremely positive indeed. And I wonder whether we couldn't roll that out beyond just rural areas where there is a need. David Stewart rightly reminded us, and it was missing from the debate, I think, so far, of the importance of occupational health services and challenging attitudes of employers, because the majority of people that perhaps experience episodic mental health still need to hold down employment and try and struggle and cope with that. But, Presiding Officer, I'm very conscious of time, so let me draw to a close by talking about the wider challenges on mental well-being. Kevin Stewart, I thought, spoke very well about welfare reform, and there is much in his speech that I agree with. And whilst I hope that mental health organisations have contributed to the Harrington Review, there is a real need to provide support and advice to those faced with having to reapply for their benefits. And I am concerned about the preparedness of the NHS to cope with the impact. Mark McDonald rightly referred to the Deep End group of GPs and their report about the challenges they face in providing adequate support for their patients. This will, in my view, get worse with austerity. So the strategy needs to be set in the context of the likelihood of increasing levels of child poverty in Scotland, the challenge of youth unemployment and unemployment more generally, which is increasing, the challenge of a reduced standard of living with rising levels of in-work poverty that lead people to using food banks and having to use payday loans. People in our communities are increasingly struggling to cope with everyday life. The need for the strategy, Presiding Officer, is self-evident. The pressure on our mental health is increasing. The Minister will have our support if he puts in place a robust implementation plan and monitoring framework so that this strategy really does make a difference on the ground.
Thank you. I now call on Michael Matheson to wind up the debate at 10 minutes. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like many others who have been closing this debate, this has been a very good debate with some excellent contributions where a number of members have raised what I think are significant issues that they wish to see being addressed. I'm sure all members will recognise that in taking forward the strategy, we had a debate in Parliament before the consultation started, where I asked all members to feel free to engage in that process and to make their views known. Because I, like, as I'm sure all members in this chamber will recognise, that government doesn't always have the answers to dealing with all of the issues and challenges which our mental health system faces. But what we need to do is to make sure that we prioritise areas where we can believe we can make good progress and sustained progress. And since the publication of the strategy, the general feedback I've had from the sector is a general view that the strategy is moving in the right direction and that it allows us to build upon the progress that has been made in years, not just by this government, but by previous governments as well. And I think it's a tremendous credit to the Scottish Parliament and the way in which NHS Scotland has taken forward the reform of our mental health services over the last 12 to 13 years, if not before. One of the most important areas, I think, around the mental health field, which I think we must give much greater focus to, and that is around the area of early years. Early years to date has largely been associated with issues around trying to deal with health inequalities themselves, and mental health issues do not necessarily register in the same way as being some of those health inequalities which we face in our society. And one of the aspects that this strategy seeks to do is to work with the other areas within our government policy to try and make sure that we have a greater focus on those early years interventions that can make a real difference, not only in helping to improve someone's health and well-being in the future, but helping to reduce the potential for them to drift into the criminal justice system or anything else that may arise from a poor experience in their early years. And as was pointed out today is the launch of the Early Years Collaborative that Malcolm Chisholm made reference to, which I think provides an exciting opportunity to make sure that we have much greater collaboration amongst agencies in making sure that we do make a real difference in those early years where it is appropriate. I do accept the point that Richard Simpson was making, is that we should not just look at early years as purely being the preschool years, and the suggestions that he's made with regards to the further work that could be taken forward in schools, particularly in primary school education, I think are worth further consideration to see if there's more progress we can take and taking that forward as a preventative approach as well. He also raised the issue about the Ministerial Task Force, and of course, in looking at the evidence base that's now emerging around a whole range of areas, whether it be physical or mental health issues, tackling health inequalities is not just about physical health, it's about mental health as well. But it's an issue about social justice. And if we are to get to the root causes of it, we have to tackle the issues of social injustice much more effectively than has happened over many, many years. A number of members now have also made reference to CAM services and the changes which have happened in CAM services. Richard Simpson and Christine Graham will recall our inquiry in the last Health Committee in the last Parliament in looking at the whole issue of the provision of CAM services. And Mary Scanlon was a member of that committee as well. I apologise if I've forgotten anyone else who's here today. But all of whom identified the issue that there was a need to improve access to CAM services and much earlier intervention when issues do arise. And the additional resource that has been provided over the last 4 years, I think all members across the Chamber recognise, has made a marked difference in assisting in improving earlier access to those services, which is to make sure that we intervene at the earliest opportunity to try and help to support a young person who may be exhibiting mental health issues. That also brings me on to the whole issue about improving access to psychological therapies. It's important to recognise that although it's difficult to give exact figures at the present moment because some of the data is incomplete, it's not to the level which allows us to be exactly confident about the scale of it, but what some of the data is indicating that there are a significant number of people who are making use of different psychological therapies within NHS Scotland, and I hope to be in a position where the data is of a higher quality for that to be published later this year. It's more an issue about data quality rather than anything else in terms of its publication. But I've got no doubt that once that data is actually published, it will help to give focus to make sure that we maintain improvement in this area and also to demonstrate the scale to which patients are benefiting from it. I think it also sits alongside some of the issues and some of the discussion around antidepressants as well. I think too often there can be too simplistic a read across to the issue about the levels of antidepressants means that we don't have enough psychological therapies. That's not necessarily always the case. A combination may be appropriate, and in some cases it may be that antidepressants are the best course of action rather than some form of psychological therapy. But we should not always make an automatic link between levels of antidepressant prescribing and that of psychological therapies. But I hope members will be reassured that we'll try to publish the data later this year once we've addressed some of the issues around its quality. Now, a number of members have made reference to older people and mental health issues, and Malcolm Chisholm made reference to that, as Richard Simpson did, and several other speakers made reference to it. There is absolutely no chance that a strategy that I'm responsible for would be able to have anything in it other than an element which recognised the whole issue of older people with mental health problems with someone like Eddie Kelly in my constituency who works with the DAM, who is a very passionate advocate of the need to make sure that we improve services for older people with mental health problems. A number of members have made mention of the dementia aspect, but the whole issue about improving services for older people with mental health problems is that they can benefit from the improvements we make in improving access to psychological therapies because they're not there for younger people or anyone of a particular age group. But I think what is necessary is a greater recognition of the numbers of older people who can experience mental health problems. And there is still some work to do in making sure that we achieve that. I think Dennis Robertson also made a good observation about the whole opportunity that arises from the integration of health and social care in making sure that our local authorities and our health services are much more coordinated in the way in which they deliver services for older people in the most effective way. And one of the important aspects, though, in improving access to psychological therapies is that it doesn't always have to be a psychologist. Sometimes it is about improving access to social prescribing, which a strategy sets out as well, or increasing physical activity, all of which have an important contribution to make around. I've got a lot I'm trying to cover, if you don't mind, from this debate, all of which I think are important parts that can actually help to contribute towards improving older people's mental health issues. Dennis Robertson also raised the issue around eating disorders, and I met with Dennis Robertson yesterday to discuss the progress that we are making in this area and the further work that's necessary in this particular field. And I will continue to work with Dennis in making sure that we do what we can to make sure that we improve the way in which services are delivered for those who may be experiencing eating disorder. Some members have also made reference to crisis services. This is an area where I think we have to get much better at the way in which we deliver these services within Scotland. I had the pleasure of visiting the project in Leith. I had the pleasure of opening the project in Leith. And I think there's real benefit from being able to give people an opportunity to go to a particular venue that is not necessarily a health facility, but gives someone the time out that's necessary and the support that's necessary to be able to address some of the issues that they may be finding difficult at that particular time. And some of the pilot work we're doing as well in NHS Tayside is to look at how we can be much better at identifying individuals who may present in distress or in crisis, and to make sure that agencies are better at tracking them when they do present to services. Because we know from research and looking at suicides is that these are not individuals who very often have not presented to services. Many of them are presented to services time in and time out, and it's not been picked up effectively. And we must get much better at that. That's not just about health services, that's also about local authorities, social work departments, and it's also about the criminal justice system being much more effective about it as well. Touching briefly on the criminal justice system, I accept the points that Mary Fee has raised and also that Christine Graham has raised, and this is an area where we need to make more progress. I do think there's a greater opportunity presented with the mental health services within our prisons now being part of NHS Scotland, which gives us an opportunity to address some of the challenges which are there. In drawing my remarks to a close, Presiding Officer, one of the most important areas I think has been highlighted is about the ongoing work around stigma in Scotland and reducing stigma associated with mental health. David Stewart made a very good contribution in this particular area. We need to make sure that we maintain momentum in this whole area to remove the stigma that can often be associated with mental health. But I think we should also take that further. We also need to not only tackle the issue of stigma, but we also have to tackle the issue of discrimination against those who may have a mental health issue from not being able to engage in services in the way in which they should, or to receive the services that they deserve to receive. And some of the work I wish to see taken forward as part of the strategy is a focus on discrimination as well, that many people with a mental health issue may experience. Malcolm Chisholm said that he reflected upon the difference between the draft strategy and the final strategy. I hope members will be reassured that we have genuinely listened to all of those stakeholders who have an interest in mental health services in Scotland to make sure that we have a mental health service strategy that is fit for the 21st century and will deliver real change and build on the improvements we have gained over recent years.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate on Scotland's mental health strategy. I have a point of order from Jim Hume.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As a point of order, Deputy Presiding Officer, this morning the Cabinet Secretary for Health announced an emergency care action plan in response to the well-reported difficulties being experienced at accident and emergency units across the country. This comes after repeated assurances from him that these were isolated instances and that no action would be taken. Unfortunately, the announcement was done in a press release and not, as it clearly should have been, to this chamber to allow members to scrutinise the plans in detail. This announcement comes 2 weeks after I was told that topical questions not to paint the picture I was trying to paint, and 24 hours after the Cabinet Secretary accused the BBC of dishonesty and of broadcasting factual inaccuracies. The fact is, Deputy Presiding Officer, a complete policy reversal has occurred within the last 24 hours, and members in this Parliament will not have the opportunity to question the Cabinet Secretary in detail.
Mr. Hume, could you tell me your point of order, please?
Do you agree with me, Deputy Presiding Officer, that in the first instance such important announcements must be made to the Chamber, and can you confirm whether time exists in next week's business programme for a ministerial statement on this matter?
Thank you. Order. The member did give an indication, and I thank him for that, of wishing to make a point of order. I would say to the Chamber that decisions on when and how to make announcements are judgments for the Scottish Government, and of course there are a number of ways in which they can keep Parliament informed. The member asks a question about the business programme, If I could say to the member that the business programme of the Parliament, and indeed requests for ministerial statements, are matters for the business managers in the first instance, and so therefore I suggest that Mr Hume raises this issue with his representative on the Parliamentary Bureau. The presiding officers, as we have often said in this chamber, cannot require Scottish ministers to make statements in this chamber. We now turn to the next item of business, which is decision time. And there are 3 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that Amendment 5444.2 in the name of Richard Simpson, which seeks to amend Motion 5444 in the name of Michael Matheson on Scotland's mental health strategy, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, therefore we will move to a vote, and members should cast their votes now, please. Order. The result of the vote on amendment number 5444.2 in the name of Richard Simpson is as follows. Yes 53, no 60. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. That brings us to the second question, which is that amendment 5444.1 in the name of Jim Hume, which seeks to amend motion number 5444 in the name of Michael Matheson on Scotland's mental health strategy, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed, and therefore we will move to a vote, and members should please cast their votes now. Order. The result of vote on amendment number 5444.1 in the name of Jim Hume is as follows. Yes 51, no 62. There were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The third question then is that motion 5444 in the name of Michael Matheson on Scotland's mental health strategy be agreed. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time, and I now close this meeting of Parliament.